I had always been drawn to the serenity of the wilderness, finding solace in the embrace of nature. So, when I stumbled upon a listing for a secluded cabin nestled deep within the dense forests of the American Southwest, I couldn't resist. The idea of spending a week away from the chaos of city life, surrounded by towering pines and the gentle hum of wildlife, was too enticing to pass up. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, with the paved roads gradually giving way to gravel and then to mere dirt paths. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the canopy above thickened, allowing only slivers of sunlight to pierce through. The air grew cooler, filled with the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves. My GPS had long lost signal, but the handwritten directions provided by the cabin's owner seemed straightforward enough. Upon arrival, the cabin stood as a quaint structure, its wooden exterior weathered by time but sturdy. A small porch wrapped around the front, offering a perfect spot to sip morning coffee while listening to the chirping birds. Inside, the cabin was modestly furnished. A stone fireplace dominated the living area, a compact kitchen with basic amenities, and a single bedroom with a large window overlooking the forest. A stack of firewood was neatly piled beside the fireplace, and a few oil lamps were scattered around, hinting at the cabin's lack of modern electricity. As dusk approached, I decided to explore the immediate surroundings. A narrow trail led from the back of the cabin into the heart of the forest. The path was lined with ferns and occasionally crossed by the scurrying of small woodland creatures. The tranquility was palpable, with only the rustling of leaves and distant calls of owls breaking the silence. Returning to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire in the hearth and settled into an old armchair with a book. The warmth of the flames and the rhythmic crackling of burning would create a cozy ambience. Outside, the forest was cloaked in darkness, the moon casting a silvery glow over the treetops. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a peculiar sound, a distant, high-pitched wail that echoed through the trees. At first, I dismissed it as the call of some nocturnal animal, perhaps a coyote. But as the minutes passed, the wailing grew louder, more pronounced, and seemed to be drawing closer. It wasn't the cry of any animal I was familiar with. There was an unsettling human-like quality to it. Curiosity mingled with a tinge of apprehension. I approached the window and peered into the inky blackness. The forest was still, save for the occasional sway of branches in the gentle breeze. Just as I was about to turn away, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to discern its form. I told myself it was likely a deer or some other wildlife and decided to head to bed, attributing the eerie sounds to the unfamiliarity of the wilderness at night. The following day was uneventful. I spent it hiking and immersing myself in the natural beauty surrounding the cabin. The strange occurrences of the previous night faded from my mind as I basked in the sunlight filtering through the leaves and the soothing sounds of a nearby babbling brook. As evening descended once more, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The memory of the wailing and the fleeting shadow lingered at the back of my mind. To calm my nerves, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled on the porch, watching as the sky transitioned from amber to deep indigo. The tranquility was shattered by the sudden snap of a twig nearby. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line, eyes straining to penetrate the gathering darkness. There, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a deer, its eyes reflecting the dim light. But something was off, the proportions were wrong, and its posture seemed unnatural, almost humanoid. Before I could react, the creature bolted into the forest with astonishing speed, disappearing into the shadows. I sat there, breathless and bewildered, questioning what I had just witnessed. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., A series of soft taps resonated from the front door. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The tapping continued, methodical and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I approached the door and called out, asking who was there. No response came, only the persistent tapping. Grabbing a fireplace poker as a makeshift weapon, I flung the door open, ready to confront whatever or whoever was outside. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was silent, as if holding its breath. A cold breeze swept through, sending a shiver down my spine. I quickly shut the door, bolting it securely, and retreated to the safety of the fireplace's glow. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Exhausted and unnerved, I decided to cut my trip short. The allure of solitude had been overshadowed by the inexplicable events that plagued my nights. As I packed my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every move. Driving away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the mysterious figure lurking at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, only the swaying trees and the fading outline of the cabin. Back in the comfort of my apartment, the events of those nights haunted me. I scoured the internet, seeking explanations. It was then that I stumbled upon the legend of the Skinwalker, a malevolent shapeshifter from Native American folklore, capable of mimicking human voices and taking on animal forms to lure unsuspecting victims. While I couldn't definitively say what I encountered, the descriptions matched my experiences eerily well. The realization sent chills through me, and I vowed never to return to that secluded cabin in the woods. In the years since, I've often reflected on that unsettling week. The rational part of me seeks logical explanations. Perhaps it was a series of coincidences, amplified by isolation and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that I brushed against something beyond comprehension, a lurking presence in the shadows of the forest. Though the experience left me with more questions than answers, it served as a stark reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the world, waiting for the unwary to stumble upon them. My uncle's house was deep in the country, the kind of place where the night swallowed everything whole. He had built it himself, every beam, every nail, everything crafted by his own hands. It sat on a stretch of acreage that he had cleared just enough for a house, a driveway, and a wide wraparound deck that made it perfect for summer gatherings. Beyond that, it was nothing but woods and cow pastures stretching for miles. No neighbors, no streetlights, just open land and thick trees. It was the kind of place where darkness had a different weight, where it wasn't just an absence of light but something that pressed in thick and absolute. The night was a living thing out there, and once the sun dipped below the tree line, it felt like the world beyond the porch didn't exist anymore. That day, the house was alive with family, maybe 20 adults and a handful of kids running wild in the yard, barefoot and reckless. The kind of summer day that felt endless, where the heat shimmered off the ground and the air smelled like barbecue and sunscreen. The sky had been a pale, cloudless blue, and though the sun beat down hard, a faint breeze carried enough coolness to make it bearable. I had been there all afternoon, drinking cold sodas, eating way too much food, and watching my cousins chase each other around in the yard while the adults sat on the deck, talking and laughing. It was the kind of family gathering where time slipped away, where you didn't realize how long you'd been there until someone looked at the cooler and said, "We're out of drinks," or went inside to grab something and came back saying, "We're out of ice." That's how I ended up driving into town. I wasn't gone long, maybe 40 minutes. The drive was easy enough, just a straight shot down an old two-lane road with no lights except for the occasional flicker of a porch bulb on a far-off farmhouse. I picked up the groceries, some more drinks, a few extra bags of chips, more ice, the usual stuff, and started back as the sun was just beginning to set. The thing about being out in the country is that when the sun goes down, it goes down. No streetlights, no glow from a city skyline, nothing. 1 minute, everything was bathed in that warm, golden light, and the next, it was like someone had flipped a switch. The road ahead of me was a tunnel of blackness, my headlights cutting through it but barely making a dent. By the time I turned onto my uncle's long gravel driveway, it was full dark. His house stood like an island in the blackness, the porch lights casting a warm glow over the deck, laughter and music drifting through the open windows. The party was still going strong. Kids still ran around, their shadows darting across the grass, their voices carrying through the night. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of my headlights hitting the edge of the yard. But then it moved, slow, deliberate, a shape low to the ground, sleek and black, sitting right at the edge of the party, watching. A panther. It was just sitting there, watching the house, watching the people, watching the kids. My stomach tightened, my hands gripping the steering wheel as my headlights illuminated its form. It wasn't some stray dog, some wandering coyote. This was something different. Its body was long and muscular. Its tail curled slightly at the tip as it sat still, completely unbothered by my presence. Its head was turned toward the house, ears forward, eyes locked on the movement in the yard. It was close, too close. I kept the car running, my headlights burning into its dark coat, but it didn't move. It didn't flinch. It didn't startle like most animals would when caught in a bright light. It just sat there, its breathing slow, steady. It had placed itself there, right at the edge where the kids were playing. My pulse pounded in my ears. My hands were slick against the steering wheel. My breath felt too loud in my chest. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at it. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Then finally it moved. Not fast, not startled, not scared. It turned its head, looking directly at me, those yellow-green eyes reflecting the light. And the way it looked at me, there was no fear, no surprise, just recognition, like it knew I was watching, like it knew it had been caught. And then, in the strangest, most unsettling moment of the whole thing, it sighed. Not a growl, not a hiss, a sigh. A deep, long exhale, almost human, almost like it was disappointed. Then it stood, stretched in one slow, fluid motion, and turned. Its muscles rippled under its sleek black coat as it padded toward the tree line, slipping into the shadows without a sound. Gone. Just like that. I sat there for a long time, my car still running, my headlights still cutting across the empty space where it had been. I don't know what unsettled me more, the fact that it had been there watching or the way it had left. Not in fear, not in a rush, just done. Like it had seen enough, like it had decided to leave on its own terms. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to turn off the car, forced myself to step out, my legs unsteady beneath me as I walked toward the house, my heart still hammering against my ribs. The laughter, the music, the voices, it all felt too normal, too unaware of what had just been there, of what had been watching. I found my uncle near the grill, flipping burgers, his face flushed from the heat of the fire and the few beers he'd had. I pulled him aside, my voice low, my pulse still racing. There was a panther, I told him, right there, watching. I pointed toward the spot at the edge of the yard, but it was just empty now, just grass and darkness. He looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged, taking a slow sip from his beer. Yeah, he said finally, they're out here, like it was nothing, like it was just another part of the land, another thing that lived in the dark. Maybe it was, but I still sat on the porch that night instead of walking out into the yard. I still kept my back to the house, watching the tree line, watching the dark, because I knew it was out there, and I knew that it hadn't been scared of us at all. I've been camping out in the wild enough times to have my fair share of strange encounters with wildlife. Some of those encounters, however, are more unnerving than others. Over the years, I've had big cats in camp more times than I can count, mostly just nosing around and getting curious. But there was this one night that sticks with me even now. I was deep in the backcountry, miles away from any kind of civilization, camped out with a small crew of friends. We had set up our tents in a tight cluster around the fire pit, with enough space between us to keep things comfortable but close enough to keep the conversation going late into the night. It was the kind of camping where you didn't worry too much about anything. No phone service, no distractions. It was just the peace of the wilderness and the rhythm of the fire crackling in front of us. We'd had a long day of hiking and setting up camp, and by the time the sun sank low in the sky, we were all tired. Dinner was quick, and the night settled around us like a heavy blanket, the kind of night where the stars feel closer, and the air has that chill that tells you the temperature is going to drop. But even with the cold creeping in, there was something soothing about being out in the woods, knowing you were a million miles away from the chaos of everyday life. By the time we were all tucked into our tents, the forest around us had fallen eerily still. It was that silence where every little sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, felt like it was amplified by the quiet. I lay there, listening to the wind brushing through the trees, hoping for a restful night. But of course, that never happens when you're camping. I drifted in and out of sleep, half aware of the noises outside. Then it happened. I woke up suddenly to a sound I couldn't place at first. A soft, guttural cough. Not the kind you hear when someone's clearing their throat. This was different. It was a sound that seemed almost deliberate, heavy in the stillness of the night. At first, I thought it was one of my friends just outside their tent, maybe having a bad dream or waking up to take a piss. But then I heard it again, and that's when I realized what it was. I held my breath. The cough was deep, resonating, like it was coming from something much bigger than any of us. I could feel the vibrations of it in my chest. It was so close, closer than I would have liked, and it made my blood run cold. I lay there, frozen in place, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing by. Maybe a deer or some other harmless creature. But as the sound repeated itself, louder this time, more distinct, I knew better. It was a lion. I could hear it coughing, almost like it was clearing its throat in the same deliberate way big cats do. It's a sound you can't mistake once you've heard it a few times. My mind raced through all the things I'd read about lions, how they're mostly stealthy, mostly avoid humans. But none of that comforted me in that moment. I was lying in a thin tent, a mere couple of feet away from a predator that could tear through the fabric with one swipe of its paw. The realization settled in, and I just lay there, too scared to move, too scared to breathe too loudly. The lion was right outside. I could hear its breathing, slow and measured, and I knew that it wasn't just curious anymore. It was in my space. The fact that it was so close, that close to my head, with nothing more than a thin layer of fabric between us, made my skin crawl. The coughing sound came again, and I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath me. I didn't want to look outside, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled my head back as quietly as I could and peeked through the small opening in my tent. There was nothing, just the blackness of the forest, the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the night breeze. No lion in sight, but I knew it was out there, somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision. The minutes felt like hours. Every time I thought I might be able to drift back to sleep, I heard another sound. Another cough or a low growl that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the kind of growl you hear from a house cat. It was a rumbling, guttural sound that made it clear this was an apex predator. I had to remind myself not to make a sound, not to move, I'd heard stories from other campers about lions walking through their camps, sometimes sniffing at tents, but never getting too close. They'd usually leave after a little while. That's what I kept telling myself, that the lion would eventually move on just like the others. But as I lay there, staring at the dim outline of my tent and listening to that coughing sound, I wasn't so sure. It felt like an eternity before I heard the lion's steps again, soft and light, as if it was circling my camp, sizing up my crew. I listened closely, but there was no way of telling where it was. Could have been right outside or farther away. My heart pounded in my ears, but I didn't dare make a sound. After what felt like hours, the sounds of the lion, its breathing, the occasional cough, faded into the distance. Only then did I allow myself to relax. I slowly let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding and closed my eyes, hoping to get some sleep before morning. But I didn't drift off easily. Every little sound outside, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch, had me on edge. I tried to convince myself that the lion was long gone, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Eventually, though, I did fall asleep, or at least I think I did. My mind kept flicking between sleep and wakefulness, aware of the world around me, but too tired to keep my eyes open. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. The warmth of the early light spilling into my tent was a relief. I had barely slept, but there was nothing I could do about it. I listened for a few seconds, trying to hear any signs of the lion, but there was only the quiet of the morning forest. I let out a long breath of relief. I didn't say anything to the others right away. I knew they'd ask why I looked so tired, but I didn't want to freak anyone out. I'd seen the lion, and I'd made it through the night. That was enough for me. After a quick breakfast, we packed up our camp and headed out. As we walked through the woods, I kept a close eye on the trees, my ears straining for any sounds out of the ordinary. The memory of that night, the lion's cough, its slow breathing, stuck with me like a shadow I couldn't shake. But that wasn't the only strange encounter I had during that trip. A few nights later, we found ourselves camping near a small village. It wasn't much of a village, just a few scattered homes, but it offered a little comfort to be close to something resembling civilization. It also meant we had the perimeter of the village to protect us from wild animals, at least a little, or so we thought. At around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound that had me sitting up in my tent before I even realized what was going on. It was loud, unmistakable, and totally bizarre. I had heard wild animals at night before, but nothing had ever sounded like this. The sound was like a bellow, a deep, guttural noise that echoed through the trees, making my heart race. It was so close, and for a moment, I thought it might be a lion again or something worse. But then I heard it again, and I realized with a start what it was. It was a donkey, a very amorous donkey. The thing was bellowing out loud, its cries ringing through the forest in a way that sounded exactly like the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. In the still of the night, it felt like the sound could have come from anything, something massive and dangerous. I was wide awake now, adrenaline rushing through me, and I was just about to scramble out of my tent when the whole camp, all in their separate tents, burst into laughter. It had startled everyone, and soon enough, the whole camp was in stitches, laughing so hard that it was impossible to keep a straight face. I lay back down in my tent, still chuckling to myself. Despite the shock, it had been kind of funny in a strange way. The fear I'd felt melted away with the laughter, and I was able to get back to sleep easily. That was the moment I realized how unpredictable these nights in the wild could be. One minute, you're terrified out of your mind, and the next, you're lying there laughing at a donkey. We finished our trip uneventfully, but I'll always remember the feeling of that lion so close to me in the dark. It reminded me of the rawness of nature, of how fragile we are in the face of animals far stronger and more dangerous than we'll ever be. And the donkey? Well, that just reminded me that the wild has a sense of humor. Sometimes it's just a little too loud when it decides to show it. Camping in the middle of nowhere always seemed like a good idea in theory. Wide open skies, no cell service, no responsibilities. Just a weekend with friends, a fire, and a few beers. The kind of trip where you convince yourself that nothing bad ever happens in places like this. That's what I thought the first time we went out to the Arizona desert. There were 8 of us, split between 3 tents, all parked at the edge of a rocky clearing. No campsites, no rangers, no roads. Just a dirt path winding its way through scattered brush, leading to a place no one would stumble across unless they had a reason to be out here. The first night had been normal. We set up camp, grilled some burgers over the fire, and stayed up way too late telling stories. The beer and exhaustion eventually hit, and by around 2 a.m., we crawled into our tents. The temperature had dropped, and the only sounds were the occasional pop of smoldering logs and the desert wind moving through the brush. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know why. Maybe it was the silence, too silent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I heard it. A sniffing sound. Slow, deliberate, right outside the tent. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a bear, maybe a coyote. It wasn't unheard of for something to wander into camp if we hadn't tied up the garbage properly. I mentally cursed my friends, wondering if one of them had left food out. My heart pounded as I stayed completely still, breathing as quietly as possible. Then I heard the sniffing move. Not away, not toward the fire, but toward the other tent. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't quick or erratic. It was slow, deliberate. Someone was sniffing at our tents. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. In the dark, I felt someone in my tent grab my arm. A silent confirmation. I wasn't the only one awake. None of us moved. We barely breathed. The sniffing continued, moving along the fabric, pausing, then shifting to the next spot. I could hear it over my own heartbeat, over the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. Then movement from the other tent. A zipper. Someone, one of my friends, yanked their tent open and burst outside, screaming. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. And then there was a gunshot. A single deafening crack. Scrambling noises. Running footsteps. I could hear them tearing through the brush, crunching over rocks. The sniffing sound was gone. For a second, no one moved. Then my friend, the one who had fired the shot, shouted that it wasn't an animal. It was a man. That was all we needed to hear. I didn't care what we had packed, what was left behind. None of us did. We ripped the tents from the ground, threw everything into the trucks, and peeled out of there so fast the dust hadn't even settled by the time we were a mile down the dirt road. We didn't stop until we hit the highway. No one spoke. No one slept. We just drove. We tried to rationalize it later. Maybe it was some drifter, some homeless guy who'd found our campsite and thought he could get some food. But why was he sniffing the tents? Why had he gone to each one like he was searching for something? We never got the answers. And after that night, we swore we wouldn't go back. But a year later, we did. We convinced ourselves that it had been a one-time thing, a freak encounter. This time, we thought we were smarter. Instead of setting up tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. No tents to sniff at, no thin sheets of nylon separating us from whatever was out there. Just steel, locked doors, and a clear view of our surroundings. We picked a slightly different spot, but still close enough to the original area. Same kind of terrain, flat, open desert with only a few scattered trees and bushes. No one else around. No lights, no signs of people. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, I woke up. A light, bright, harsh, right in my face. I was lying in the back of my SUV, next to my girlfriend. The hatch was cracked open for air, but the rest of the car was locked. The second that light hit my face, instinct took over. I stayed still, kept my breathing slow, even pretended to be asleep. My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't move. The light shifted, moved away from my car. I waited, straining to hear. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving to the next truck. I cracked my eyes open, just enough to see without being obvious. It was a man, older, grayish hair, standing between our vehicles, shining a flashlight into each one. Not searching for anything, not looking for supplies, just watching us. One by one, he walked to each truck, each SUV, shining his light through the windows, staring at whoever was inside. My muscles tensed. I wanted to sit up, grab something, do anything, but I didn't. I wasn't the only one awake. I could tell. The others were pretending too. The man didn't say anything, didn't try to open doors, just looked. Then, after what felt like forever, he turned. He walked away, slowly, heading back toward the tree line. The second he was out of sight, I moved. I bolted upright, shaking my girlfriend awake. She was already aware, already breathing fast. I wasn't the only one. Across the clearing, I saw movement. Our friends, sitting up, scrambling. Some had already jumped out of their trucks, whispering frantically. We weren't taking chances. No one needed to say a word. We threw everything into the cars and peeled out of there, tires kicking up dust. We didn't stop, didn't talk. We drove straight back to town, to a gas station parking lot, where we finally let ourselves breathe. None of us slept that night. We never went back. To this day, I don't know who that man was. I don't know why he was out there, why he had been sniffing at our tents the year before, or why he stood there watching us sleep. But I do know this: some places aren't meant for people like us. The plan was simple: a weekend of hiking and camping in the remote wilderness. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, and this one didn't seem any different. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, knife, and a small emergency kit. My destination was a stretch of dense forest beyond an old logging road, about a 6-hour hike from where I'd parked my truck. There were no official trails, just game paths and my own sense of direction. I wanted isolation, and I was going to get it. The first part of the hike was easy. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the forest smelled alive. Pine, damp earth, and the occasional scent of wildflowers. I followed a narrow animal trail winding through the trees, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant crack of a branch. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing near a creek and decided to set up camp. The area was flat, with just enough space between the trees for my tent. I dropped my pack and stretched my legs before gathering firewood. There was plenty of dry wood nearby, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just the stillness. The wind barely moved the leaves, and there was an eerie quiet hanging over the place. I ignored it. I'd been in deep woods before, and sometimes they just felt different. I built a small fire, boiled some water, and ate a simple meal. As the sun set, the temperature dropped fast. The fire crackled, and I sat back, enjoying the warmth. But that feeling, like something was just out of sight watching, lingered. I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods can mess with your head. Shadows stretch in strange ways. Every little noise seems amplified, and your mind fills in the blanks. Then I heard something. A branch snapped in the distance. I tensed, listening. Probably just a deer. I had seen fresh tracks earlier. But a few minutes later, there was another sound, something moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate, not the quick, light steps of a deer. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no reflection of eyes. Just the thick, impenetrable forest. After a while, the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the wind shifting branches. Either way, I needed sleep. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped the door shut. Lying there in the dark, every noise seemed amplified. The wind, the distant sound of running water, the occasional rustling of leaves. I forced myself to relax, listening to my own breathing. Then, around midnight, I woke up. Not to a noise, not to movement, just an overwhelming feeling of something being wrong. I lay completely still, listening. The forest outside was silent. Not just quiet, dead silent. No insects, no wind, no distant sounds of the creek. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside my tent. I held my breath. The steps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Person. My mind raced. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I had hiked miles off any known trails. Who the hell would be walking around my camp in the middle of the night? I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The steps stopped just outside my tent. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then nothing. No movement, no retreating footsteps, just silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the thin fabric of my tent. I sat up quickly and unzipped the door. Outside, everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs of anything disturbed. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But as I packed up camp, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The pile of firewood I had stacked the night before was gone. Not scattered, not knocked over, gone. As if someone or something had taken it. I had enough. I decided to cut the trip short and hike back to my truck. The hike back felt different. The forest didn't seem as welcoming. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for anything out of place. A few hours in, I started feeling that same sense of being watched. Then I saw it, a shape far off in the trees. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an animal. It wasn't moving, just standing there, partially hidden behind a tree. I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. I walked faster. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't help it. It was gone. The rest of the hike was a blur. I don't remember much except for the panic building in my chest. Every noise, every shadow sent my nerves into overdrive. I felt like I was being herded. Not chased, not attacked, just led. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly ran to it. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the logging road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For just a split second, I saw something step out of the tree line. Person, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. And then they were gone. I didn't stop driving. I didn't look back again. I didn't breathe until I hit the main road. I still don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just some stray. It was standing at the tree line, staring, completely still. Its fur was matted and dirty, and even from the porch, I could tell it was thin, almost starved looking. It didn't bark. It didn't move. It just stood there watching. I tried to ignore it. It wasn't my problem, and I wasn't about to start feeding some wild dog that might have rabies. I had rented this cabin for a week to get away from everything. Work, people, noise. I wanted peace, not some weird, mangy animal hanging around. The place was small, just a one-room cabin with a little kitchen, a fireplace, and a cot shoved against the far wall. No running water, just a pump outside. It was old, the kind of cabin that creaked constantly, where the wood smelled damp no matter how long you kept a fire going. I didn't mind. I liked the isolation. The dog was still there when I came back inside after chopping wood. It hadn't moved an inch. Its eyes followed me, though. Dark, sunken. I couldn't tell if it was scared or if it just had nothing better to do. That night, I heard something moving around outside. The sound of leaves crunching. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't look. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a deer. I wasn't going to let some stray ruin my trip. But in the morning, there were tracks in the dirt. Paw prints. Too big for a normal dog. I didn't see the dog at all during the day. I figured maybe it had moved on. But when the sun started going down, I had that feeling again, like I was being watched. I checked out the window. There it was. Same spot, same posture, just staring. I didn't like it. Something about it put me on edge. I told myself it was just some feral dog, maybe waiting for food. But the way it stood there, like it wasn't even alive, like it had been carved out of wood, made my skin crawl. I kept the door locked that night, made sure the windows were latched too. I built up the fire and tried to get some sleep. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with dim orange light. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me up. Then I heard it, a low, deep breathing, right outside the door. I stayed completely still, listening. It wasn't sniffing or whining, just breathing, slow, steady, like it knew I was awake. I told myself to ignore it, that if I didn't react, it would go away. Then the doorknob rattled. I shot up in bed. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. The handle turning, like someone was testing it. I grabbed the hatchet I had left by the fireplace. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The rattling stopped. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, gripping the hatchet so tight my hands ached. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, slow, calm, like whoever or whatever had been there wasn't in a hurry. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I stepped outside, my breath clouding in the cold air. There were prints leading up to the door, huge paw prints, but they weren't right. The spacing was weird, too far apart, like whatever made them had been walking on two legs. I felt sick. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led back to the tree line where the dog was standing. Still, watching, I grabbed a chunk of firewood and threw it as hard as I could. "Get out of here!" I shouted. It didn't even flinch. The log hit the dirt near its front paws, and I swear, for a second, I thought I saw its mouth curl up. Not like a snarl, like a smile. I went back inside. I wanted to leave. I should have. But something about packing up in the dark, knowing that thing was out there, made me stay. I figured I'd leave in the morning, first light. That night, I barricaded the door with the chair. The hatchet stayed in my hand. I kept the fire going, watched the shadows stretch and flicker against the walls. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard scratching. Not at the door, at the window. I forced myself to look. The dog was right outside the glass. Up close, it was worse than I thought. Its fur was patchy, skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were wrong, too human, too knowing. It was on its hind legs, pressed against the window, front paws resting on the sill, staring at me. I don't know how long it stood there, maybe seconds, maybe hours. I just sat frozen, gripping the hatchet. Then, slowly, its head tilted, like it was studying me. And then, it turned and walked away, on 2 legs. I was out of there before the sun was fully up. Didn't pack, didn't eat, just grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran to the truck. I didn't look toward the trees, didn't check if it was still watching. The truck roared to life, and I peeled out of there so fast I almost lost control on the dirt road. My hands were shaking. My whole body was cold, drenched in sweat. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away. I pulled over, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing. For some stupid reason, I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just trees stretching on forever. But I had the sickening feeling that something was still watching me. I never went back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a few days away from everything. No work, no stress, no endless notifications buzzing in my pocket. Just me, my truck, and the quiet of the valley. I had picked this spot for a reason. It was deep enough in the mountains to get away from people, but not so remote that I'd have to pack in miles to reach a good campsite. The valley stretched wide, flanked by tree-covered slopes on either side, with a river cutting through the middle. It was the kind of place where cell service didn't exist, where the only sounds at night were the wind, the water, and whatever wildlife roamed nearby. I had spent the day hiking, longer than I planned, honestly. The trail had been too good to turn back early, winding through thick pines and opening up to scattered meadows. I lost track of time. By the time I started heading back to my truck, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, dragging the temperature down with it. That's when I ran into the guy. It was one of those moments where you don't hear someone approaching until they're already close enough to startle you. I was coming down a switchback, and there he was, just standing off the side of the trail. He looked like a local, weathered face, old Carhartt jacket, boots caked in dust. The kind of guy who probably grew up out here and knew every bend of the river, every game trail. He seemed friendly enough, gave me a nod, asked where I was camping. I told him I hadn't picked a spot yet, and he mentioned a place near the river, said it was a good spot, hidden from the road, close to the water, easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. Sounded perfect. By the time I made it to the site, the last of the daylight was gone. It really was a good spot, secluded, but not far from where I had parked my truck. I got a fire going, cracked open a beer, and settled in for the night. I had downloaded a few episodes of my buddy's podcast before coming out here, something lighthearted to fill the silence. Sitting there, watching the fire flicker against the trees, I felt completely at ease. I wasn't quiet about it either. I laughed out loud at some of the jokes, drank a few more beers, let the fire burn high. Out here, it didn't feel like there was anyone around to care. Since it was already late, I decided to skip setting up my tent. The truck was more comfortable anyway. I had a topper over the bed, and all my gear was already packed in there. I laid out my sleeping bag, climbed in, and shut the tailgate. With the fire still glowing outside, I fell asleep fast. I woke early. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your breath fog up the second you step outside. The valley was still quiet, except for the steady rush of the river. I got the fire going again, popped the top off another beer, and started digging through my gear to make breakfast. That's when I noticed him, a man standing at the edge of my camp. At first, I thought maybe it was the guy from the trail, but no, this was someone else. He looked homeless. His beard was long and matted, his hair wild. He had plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes, dozens of them, flapping slightly in the breeze. Some were knotted around his arms, others draped over his shoulders like makeshift armor. His clothes were filthy, stained with dirt and grease. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at me, just stood there. I tried to act casual, made some comment about how nice the day was. No response. He started moving slow, deliberate steps, pacing along the perimeter of my camp. He never looked directly at me, but I could see his eyes darting around, scanning my gear, my truck, my fire. I asked if he wanted breakfast. Nothing. I offered him a beer. Nothing. The whole time, he kept that weird, aimless pacing, like he was waiting for something, like he was trying to decide something. That's when my gut started screaming at me. This wasn't right. There was something off about him. Not just the way he looked, but the way he moved, the way he refused to acknowledge me. It felt deliberate, calculated. I slowly reached for my bear spray. My buck knife was already within arm's reach. I kept my voice steady, told him he needed to acknowledge me or leave. He didn't. He just kept pacing, turning his back to me, shuffling in slow, uneven circles. I took a step toward him, bear spray in hand. That's when he stopped. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the truck, kicking dirt over the fire, slamming the tailgate shut. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the driver's seat, but I didn't stop moving, didn't stop looking over my shoulder. The road out of the valley was rough, winding through thick forest before climbing back up toward the highway. Every few seconds, I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. I don't know how long he had been there. I don't know if he had been watching me the night before, listening to me laugh by the fire, waiting until morning to step out of the trees. I don't know what he wanted, but I do know this. If I had slept in my tent instead of my truck, I might not have heard him coming, and I don't think he would have just walked away. I never really liked staying at my uncle's cabin, but I owed him a favor. He was taking his family on a trip and needed someone to watch over the place for a week. I agreed before I really thought about it, mostly because he'd helped me out in the past. But as soon as I pulled up the long dirt road leading to the cabin, I started regretting it. It wasn't the kind of cozy, vacation-type cabin you'd see in magazines. This one was old, built in the 60s, and meant to be more functional than comfortable. It sat deep in the woods, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest gas station, and even further from any real town. The place had running water, but no internet or cell service. My uncle kept a landline for emergencies, but other than that, I was completely cut off. I arrived just before sunset, parking my truck near the front steps. The cabin looked the same as it always had. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a single yellow light above the front door. The forest around it was thick, the trees so close together that they swallowed most of the light. It was quiet, too quiet. Even with the truck's engine running, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in. I killed the engine, grabbed my bags, and made my way inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood. My uncle had warned me that the place might be a little musty since it had been locked up for a while, so I opened a couple of windows. The living room had a couch, an old recliner, and a coffee table covered in rings from sweating beer bottles. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, cold and unused. The kitchen was small, just a stove, a sink, and a fridge. My uncle had stocked it with enough food to last me the week, mostly canned stuff and frozen meat. There was one bedroom and a tiny bathroom with a weak shower. The whole place felt cramped and isolated, but I told myself it was only for a week. That first night, I didn't do much. I made a quick dinner, read a few pages of an old book I found on the shelf, and went to bed early. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the trees outside. The cabin creaked and groaned like it was settling into itself, and I kept waking up to every little noise. A branch scraping against the side of the cabin, something shifting outside in the leaves, the distant sound of what might have been an owl, but could have just as easily been something else. By morning, I felt exhausted. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, looking out at the woods. It was overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel heavier. I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. It was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing more. I spent most of the day keeping myself busy. I chopped some firewood, checked the generator, and walked the property a bit. There wasn't much out there besides trees, but my uncle had a shed about 50 yards from the cabin where he kept tools and a few spare supplies. It was locked, but I had the key. I didn't have a reason to go inside yet, so I left it alone. That second night was when things started to feel off. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard something outside. I had been reading again, trying to ignore the way the wind howled through the trees, when a noise broke through the usual forest sounds. It wasn't just wind or creaking wood. It was something deliberate, a heavy, dragging sound, like something was moving across the dirt just beyond the porch. I turned off the lantern and moved toward the window, keeping low. The porch light didn't reach far, but I could just barely make out a shape near the edge of the trees. It was too dark to tell what it was, but it was big. Not a deer, not a raccoon. It stood there for a long time, completely still, just watching. I don't know how long I stayed crouched by that window, barely breathing. But after what felt like forever, the shape moved. Not toward the cabin, but sideways, disappearing back into the trees. I waited, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a bear passing through. I told myself that as I locked the doors and checked the windows. Twice. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every little noise set me on edge. The wind, the trees, even my own breathing. But nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin, just to put my mind at ease. I found tracks in the dirt near the porch. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't even animal tracks. They were footprints, bare footprints. They led from the edge of the woods to the side of the porch, then back again. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. Who the hell would be walking around out here, barefoot, in the middle of the night? There were no houses for miles, no campsites, nothing, just woods and silence. I tried to push it out of my head, but the day felt heavier after that. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking toward the tree line, half expecting to see that shape again. But the woods stayed still. That night, I locked everything up tight. I shut all the windows, made sure the door was bolted, and even moved the couch in front of it. It felt ridiculous, but I didn't care. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it. A thump, not inside the cabin, but close. Right outside. Then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My chest tightened. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Then came the sound of something pressing against the wood. A slow, dragging scrape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I lay awake until dawn, gripping the hunting knife I kept by my bed. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bags, loaded up the truck, and made sure the cabin was locked before driving out of there as fast as I could. I told my uncle the generator was acting up and that I didn't want to risk losing power. It was a lie, but I didn't care. A few days later, he called to check in. He thanked me for watching the place, then casually mentioned something that made my skin crawl. He said he found footprints near the cabin. Bare footprints. And the weirdest part? They led from the porch to the shed. But when he checked inside, nothing was missing. The only thing out of place. The lock was broken. From the inside. I was never one for renting out cabins. If I was going to be out in the woods, I preferred a tent and a sleeping bag, maybe a campfire if the conditions were safe. But after a long, stressful few months at work, I wanted something easy, No hauling gear, no worrying about the weather, no setting up or breaking down camp. Just a few days alone in the quiet of the forest. I found a listing for a small, off-grid cabin deep in the northern woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was advertised as a true escape into nature, with no electricity, no Wi-Fi, and no cell service. Just a wood stove, a hand-pumped well, and a lantern. It seemed perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch was a rough dirt road, barely more than a pair of tire tracks cutting through the trees. My car wasn't built for off-roading, and I had to take it slow, weaving around potholes and fallen branches. The sun was low by the time I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was exactly what I pictured: small, rustic, tucked beneath towering pines. A porch wrapped around the front, and a stack of firewood sat beside the door. I stepped out of the car and stretched, breathing in the crisp air. The woods were thick, dark even before sunset, the kind of forest where sound carried strangely. I heard the rustling of leaves, distant bird calls, the occasional crack of a branch shifting under its own weight. But overall, it was quiet. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and headed up to the cabin. The key was hidden under a loose board on the porch, just like the owner had said in their instructions. The lock clicked open and I pushed inside. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been here in a while. The cabin was simple: one room, plus a small bathroom with a composting toilet. A bed against the far wall, a wooden table, a few chairs, and a tiny kitchen area with a propane stove. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, though I figured I'd use the wood stove instead. There was a single window above the sink and another beside the bed, both small. I set my bag down and lit the lantern. As the light flickered to life, I noticed something odd. There were no curtains on the windows. It wasn't a big deal, just something that stood out. It made the cabin feel more exposed. But I wasn't about to let a missing set of curtains get to me. I unpacked my things, then went back outside to bring in some firewood. The woods felt different now, darker, colder. I worked fast, stacking logs inside by the stove, then locked up for the night. I made a quick dinner, ate at the table, then stretched out on the bed with a book. The lantern cast a warm glow, but beyond the window, everything was black. Every now and then, I glanced up, half expecting to see my own reflection. But there was nothing, just the empty night. Sometime later, I dozed off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something felt wrong. The lantern was out, the fire in the stove had burned low, and the room was cold. I lay still, listening. First, there was nothing, just silence. Then a sound, faint but close, something moving outside. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal rustling in the underbrush. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath. The sound came from the porch, the wood creaking under an unfamiliar weight. My car keys were on the table, my phone useless this far from town. I had nothing to defend myself with except the heavy flashlight by the bed. Then another sound. Not footsteps this time. A soft, slow tapping. Took me a second to realize it was coming from the window. I stared into the darkness. Nothing stared back, but I knew deep down that something was there. The tapping stopped. Silence again. Then the porch creaked once more, and I heard the sound of retreating steps. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, barely breathing. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbed the flashlight, and crept toward the door. I hesitated before looking out. If someone was out there, I didn't know what I'd do, but I had to know. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window. The beam caught nothing but trees and empty porch. I exhaled, my breath shaky. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a tree branch scraping the cabin, a trick of the wind. Still, I locked the door, checked it twice, then climbed back into bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made my skin crawl, but eventually exhaustion won. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, feeling foolish. The woods looked normal again, bathed in early light, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, and they led from the trees up to the window, then back into the forest. I packed my things and left. I needed a break, a real one. City life had been pressing in on me for months, and I couldn't take the noise, the crowds, or the constant weight of work any longer. A cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. Just me, a week of fresh air, and nothing but the sounds of nature to keep me company. I found the rental online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple one-room cabin tucked deep into the forest, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The pictures showed a weathered wooden structure with a covered porch, an old fire pit out front, and a long gravel driveway disappearing into the trees. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell reception. Exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than expected. The road turned from pavement to dirt, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Overgrown branches scraped against my truck as I crawled along the last few miles. The directions said to look for a wooden sign nailed to a tree that read Broken Pine, and sure enough, I found it. Weathered and nearly unreadable, half swallowed by the bark. The cabin sat at the end of the path, just like the photos. It looked even older in person, the wood darkened from years of exposure, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A rusty old axe was buried in a tree stump out front, and a stack of firewood sat beside the porch. The place had been used recently enough. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. No traffic, no sirens, no voices. Just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood shifting in the breeze. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just as the owner had told me in the email. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open, and the inside smelled like dust and pine. It was simple. A single room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The windows were small, their glass old and slightly warped. There was a door in the back that led to a small bathroom, just a toilet and sink with an outdoor shower setup beyond that. I set my bag down on the bed and checked my phone. 1 bar. Enough to send a text if I needed to, but not enough for anything else. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside listening to the woods settle into night. I had expected to feel uneasy, being alone out here, but instead, I felt calm. The kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. It was around midnight when I heard the first noise. A single, heavy thud against the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. It wasn't the kind of sound trees made in the wind. It was solid, deliberate. I waited, listening, but heard nothing else. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer brushing against the wall. A raccoon knocking something over. Still, I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, shining the beam around the clearing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees stood silent and unmoving. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back inside. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Near the edge of the trees, about 20 feet from the cabin, the dirt had been disturbed. A wide, uneven patch of earth looked like it had been scraped or dragged. No tracks, no obvious sign of what had done it. Just the strange, disrupted ground. I tried not to dwell on it. The second night, the noise came again. This time, it wasn't a single thud. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, like something rough dragging against the wood. I sat up in bed, every muscle locked in place. It moved from the far wall toward the front of the cabin, the sound steady, unhurried. I reached for the flashlight, but my hands were shaking. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then came the footsteps. Not heavy, not fast, just soft, careful steps moving across the porch. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry. The steps reached the door. Silence. Then the doorknob twisted. I shot out of bed, heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and stepped toward the door as quietly as I could. The knob jiggled again, harder this time. I held my breath, waiting for the door to swing open. For something, someone to step inside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No footsteps retreating, no sound at all. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the silence, my back pressed against the wall, the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. When morning came, I forced myself to go outside. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still. But on the porch, right in front of the door, was a single boot print. Not mine. I packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for a full week. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag into the truck and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, pretending I knew what I was looking at. Everything looked fine, but I wasn't a mechanic. A mile back down the road, I remembered passing a small hunting cabin. Maybe someone was there. Maybe they had a phone. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and started walking. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. Then I saw them, boot prints, leading from the cabin. And they weren't mine. They were fresh. They followed the road for a few yards, then disappeared into the trees. I walked faster. The hunting cabin was abandoned. A rusted-out truck sat in the clearing, its windows shattered. The door hung open, revealing a collapsed cot and broken furniture inside. No phone. I had two choices: go back to my cabin and wait, or keep walking and hope I reach town before dark. I chose to walk. I made it back just before sundown, legs aching, throat raw. The guy at the gas station barely looked up when I stumbled inside, asking for a tow. It took hours for the truck to arrive, and when I finally got back to the cabin, I stayed in the driver's seat, eyes scanning the trees. The tow driver popped the hood, fiddled with something, and my truck started right up. Said it was fine, but it wasn't fine last night. I didn't tell him what happened. I just got in the truck and left. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. Watching, I never looked back. It started as a last-minute decision. I needed a break, a chance to clear my head. So when I found a cheap rental cabin deep in the woods, I didn't think twice. The listing described it as rustic but comfortable, isolated enough to offer peace and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long. The last hour was spent on winding dirt roads, the kind where dust kicks up behind your car and the trees press in close. There were no houses, no signs of life, just the occasional deer darting into the brush. My phone lost signal long before I reached the cabin. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly like the pictures. A small wooden structure with a slanted roof, an old chimney, and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It was nestled between tall pines, with a narrow path leading down to a nearby lake. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The key was under a loose brick on the porch, just as the owner had said in his last email. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was old but sturdy. Just a couch, a wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the wall. A fireplace stood cold and empty in the corner. There was no electricity, just a few battery-powered lanterns and a propane stove in the tiny kitchen. I unpacked quickly, setting my bag on the bed and lighting a lantern as the last of the daylight faded. The quiet was absolute. No cars, no voices, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I told myself I'd enjoy the silence. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, then sat outside on the porch, staring up at the stars. It was colder than I expected. I could see my breath in the air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I told myself I'd sleep early, maybe wake up with the sun, go for a hike. But something about the place felt off. Not wrong exactly, just off. Maybe it was the way the trees moved in the wind, bending and shifting like they were whispering to each other. Maybe it was the darkness, thicker than I was used to, swallowing the trees completely past a certain point. I kept glancing toward the lake, barely visible in the moonlight, a still, black mirror stretching out between the trees. Eventually, I forced myself inside, locking the door behind me. I shut off the lantern, climbed into bed, and pulled the blankets tight around my shoulders. The mattress was thin, the sheets rough, but I was exhausted. I closed my eyes. I must have slept for a few hours. Then I woke up. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. The wind had died down. The woods were completely still. Then, a creak. Not loud, not sudden. Just a slow, gentle creak of wood. I held my breath. It sounded like it had come from the porch. I told myself it was nothing. Just the cabin settling, maybe the wind shifting the boards. I turned over, pulling the blanket higher. But then, another creak. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe a raccoon? But then why was the sound so slow, so deliberate? Silence stretched on. I waited, counting seconds in my head. Nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal. The sunlight filtered through the trees, golden and soft, and the fear from the night before seemed stupid. Of course, the cabin made noises. It was old, with shifts. I made coffee on the propane stove, then decided to check out the lake. The trail leading down was narrow, overgrown in some places, but well-trodden. The water was still and clear, reflecting the trees perfectly. There was a small dock, half-rotted, jutting out into the water. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They led from the trees at the edge of the clearing, down to the dock, then stopped. Just stopped, right at the edge of the dock, like someone had walked straight into the water. I stared at them for a long time. The prints were fresh. I told myself they could have been mine. Maybe I had walked there the night before and forgotten. But my boots didn't match. These were larger, barefoot. A strange unease crept up my spine. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe the owner came by recently. Maybe a hiker passed through. Still, I didn't stay long. That night, I double-checked the lock on the door. I kept the lantern on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. For a while, nothing happened. Then, deep in the middle of the night, a sound. Not a creak this time. Something softer, closer, breathing. I sat up, heart hammering. The sound was faint, but it was there. Slow, steady breathing, just beyond the walls of the cabin. I reached for the lantern, hand shaking. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. An animal, the wind, something normal. But deep down, I knew. Someone was standing outside. I sat frozen, listening. The breathing didn't stop. It was close, right outside the window, steady and unhurried. Then, a slow scrape, like fingertips trailing along the wooden wall. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to move. The sound slid along the length of the cabin, pausing near the door. Then silence. I sat there, gripping the blankets, heart pounding against my ribs. I stayed like that for hours, waiting, barely breathing. When morning finally came, I found nothing outside. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I wasn't imagining it. I packed my bag. I didn't stay for the third night. I didn't even eat breakfast. I locked the cabin behind me, climbed into my car, and started driving. The road back felt longer, like the woods were stretching, trying to keep me there. I gripped the wheel, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, catching my breath. My phone had signal again. I opened the listing, ready to leave a review, a warning for anyone else who might stay there. But the page was gone. No listing, no cabin, like it had never existed. I stared at my screen, blood turning cold. Then, slowly, I put the car back in drive and left without looking back. The drive to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The last 2 hours had been on a winding gravel road, dust kicking up behind my truck, the trees pressing in on both sides. I hadn't seen another vehicle since I turned off the main highway, just miles of thick forest stretching out in every direction. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the road. I was supposed to meet my friend Eric out here, but he was running late. I had booked the place for a long weekend, just a simple one-room cabin deep in the woods. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just quiet. It was supposed to be relaxing, a break from everything. I told myself I needed it. Work had been getting to me, and I felt like I was running on fumes. Some time alone, hiking, fishing, maybe just sitting on the porch with a beer, seemed like exactly what I needed. The directions the owner had given me were clear. Take the gravel road past mile marker 27, turn left at the rusted mailbox, then follow the dirt path until I saw the cabin. When I finally spotted it, tucked back against a wall of tall pines, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. It looked exactly like the pictures. A small, sturdy-looking wooden cabin with a tin roof, a narrow porch with a couple of chairs, and a stone fire pit a few yards away. I pulled into the clearing, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No traffic, no distant hum of a city, just the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself I'd get used to it. I grabbed my bag and the cooler from the truck, hauled them inside, and set everything down. The inside of the cabin was simple, just a single room with a wood-burning stove, a bed pushed against the back wall, a small kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom off to the side. There was a stack of firewood beside the stove, and a couple of old hunting magazines on a wooden table near the window. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been here for a while. I checked my phone, no service. Not surprising. Eric had mentioned he might not make it until tomorrow, depending on how long work kept him. That meant I'd have the night to myself. I stepped back outside to grab more supplies, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, just barely visible in the dirt near the fire pit. But they were there, fresh enough that they hadn't been washed away by rain. I frowned, looking around. Maybe the owner had been out here recently? Maybe a hunter? The cabin was supposed to be pretty remote, though. I hadn't passed any other properties for miles. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Still, I felt uneasy. The sun was already sinking low, the sky turning a dull orange through the trees. I decided to get a fire going before it got too dark. The fire pit was well built, lined with stones, and had a pile of half-burnt logs inside. I gathered some dry branches and got to work. By the time the fire was crackling, the sky was nearly black. I set up a folding chair, grabbed a beer from the cooler, and sat down. The flames cast flickering light across the clearing, sending long, shifting shadows into the trees. The sound of the fire was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing everything. I tried to relax, but something felt off. The woods felt too quiet. I listened, waiting for the usual sounds of night, crickets, distant hoots of owls, maybe the rustling of some small animal moving through the brush. But there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. I scanned the tree line. I couldn't see anything past the reach of the firelight, but I felt watched. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone is staring at you. I told myself I was being paranoid. I finished my beer, put out the fire, and went inside. The cabin felt safer. I locked the door, checked the windows, then turned on the small lantern by the bed. The quiet inside was different, less eerie, more comfortable. I crawled into bed, listening to the faint creaks of the wooden walls settling. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easy. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep outside. My breath caught. It wasn't the sound of an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I lay frozen, ears straining in the silence. Then another step, and another, slow, measured, right outside the cabin. I wanted to believe it was Eric. Maybe he'd shown up after all. Maybe he was messing with me, but something about the way those footsteps moved didn't feel right. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it at the window. The light reflected off the glass, showing nothing but trees. No movement, no shapes. I held my breath, waiting. Silence. Had I imagined it? After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself I had. Maybe it had been a branch falling or the cabin shifting. I turned off the flashlight and forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, the unease from the night before hadn't fully faded. I stepped outside, stretching in the cool morning air. The clearing looked the same, nothing out of place. Then I saw the footprints, clearer this time. They led from the tree line to the porch, and back again. Someone had been outside last night. Watching, I felt my stomach tighten. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing out of place. The forest was still. I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left. I forced myself to go about my day. I went for a hike, tried to enjoy the scenery. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the feeling never left. By the time the sun started setting, I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't want to spend another night alone. Eric still hadn't shown up. I made up my mind. I packed my bag, loaded up my truck, and started the engine. As I backed up, my headlights swept across the tree line, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the trees, tall, motionless, watching. He didn't move. He didn't react to the headlights. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I threw the truck into drive and tore down the dirt road, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night, even after I got home. Eric called the next morning. He'd been stuck at work and hadn't made it out. I told him not to bother. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know if I was paranoid, unlucky, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like this. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the chance to be alone with my thoughts and away from the constant noise of the city. I booked the place for 5 nights. A simple log cabin, no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me, a few books, and the sounds of the forest. The owner had left the keys under a rock near the door, just as he'd said he would in his email. The cabin itself was small, just one room with a bed in the corner, a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a pump-operated sink and a compost toilet. No running water, no electricity except for a couple of dim solar-powered lights. It was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car near the cabin, and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The trees stretched high into the sky, their bare branches swaying gently in the wind. It was early spring, still cold at night but not unbearable. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I unloaded my things, mostly food, a few basic supplies, and a thick sleeping bag for the chilly nights, then locked my car and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots. The cabin smelled of old wood and stale air, like it hadn't been used in a while. I set my bags down, checked the place over, and started a fire in the stove to warm it up. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and read until my eyes grew heavy. The wind picked up outside, whispering through the trees, but inside, the fire crackled, casting soft shadows across the walls. When I finally turned in, I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No birds, no wind, just a strange, heavy stillness that made me uneasy. I got up, stretched, and made some instant coffee with water I'd brought in jugs. I stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air, and that's when I noticed something strange. My car door was open, not just unlocked, but wide open, like someone had been inside. I froze. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I always did. Cautiously, I walked over and peeked inside. Nothing seemed out of place. My bags were still in the back seat, my keys were inside the cabin, and there were no signs that anything had been taken. I checked the ground around the car but didn't see any footprints other than my own from the day before. It was strange, but I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it. Maybe the wind had blown it open, though that didn't make much sense. Still, I pushed the thought aside and locked it again. I spent the day hiking around the woods, enjoying the solitude. The sun was out, and the quiet of the forest was calming. I found a small stream about a mile from the cabin, sat by the water for a while, and then headed back as the sky darkened. That night, I made another fire, ate dinner, and read for a while. The silence outside still felt unnatural, but I tried to ignore it. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a soft rustling sound. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate, came from just outside the cabin. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. I waited, listening. The sound came again. Something moving near the wall outside, just beneath the window. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight next to my bed. The fire had died down, leaving the room in near total darkness. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window, but all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. I listened for a while longer, but the sound never came again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight, pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to my cabin and stopping just beneath my window. I stared at them, my stomach tightening. They weren't from an animal. They were human. Someone had been standing there, watching me. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave. But my car was still there, untouched. I still had no cell service, no way to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't taken anything. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd wandered too close by accident. That was the excuse I gave myself, at least. I spent the day feeling on edge, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I kept my knife on me, my flashlight in my pocket. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I kept the fire burning and stayed awake as long as I could. But eventually, exhaustion won and I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. My blood turned to ice. Someone was trying to get in. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The door was locked, but the knob twisted again, more forcefully this time. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it toward the door, and listened. The rattling stopped. Then came slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped outside the window. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I packed my things the second the sun was up. I didn't care that I had paid for 5 nights. I wasn't staying another second. I threw my bags into the car, locked the cabin behind me, and got in. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. As I drove past the trees, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the woods, watching me go. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving until I reached town, where I parked outside a gas station and sat there, shaking. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to that trip in the first place. Maybe it was the idea of getting away for a while, shutting off my phone, and just being somewhere quiet. Maybe it was because I was tired of hearing how good for me it would be. Or maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. Either way, I should have listened to my gut. My cousin, Eric, had a cabin deep in the woods. Not one of those modern, fully stocked weekend getaway types. This was an old, worn-down hunting cabin his grandfather had built decades ago. No running water, no electricity, no cell service. Just a single wood stove, a pump well outside, and a pile of chopped firewood. He used it for hunting trips, but he wasn't much of a hunter. Mostly it just sat empty. Eric swore it was peaceful. No traffic, no noise, no people. Just trees and fresh air. That's what he told me when he invited me along for the weekend. "You'll love it." I didn't love it. The drive itself was almost 2 hours, half of it on paved roads, the other half on winding dirt paths that got narrower and rougher the further we went. By the time we reached the trailhead, where we had to leave the truck and hike the last mile in, my nerves were already starting to fray. The trees were dense, stretching tall in every direction. The forest floor was thick with undergrowth, and the further we walked, the quieter it got. At first, there was the occasional sound of a bird or a rustling branch, but after about 20 minutes, it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. We reached the cabin just before sunset. It was smaller than I expected, just a single room with a slanted tin roof and a porch that looked like it could collapse at any second. The logs were dark with age, the windows small and shuttered, and the front door had deep scratches carved into it, like something had clawed at the wood years ago. Eric didn't seem to notice or care. He dropped his pack, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like old wood, damp fabric, and something stale, like a place that had been left closed up for too long. There was a single bed frame with a thin, lumpy mattress pushed against the wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with some canned food and an old lantern. A rusted-out wood stove sat in the corner with a pile of ash still in it. Cozy, right? Eric grinned, but I just nodded, pretending I wasn't already regretting this trip. We got a fire going before dark. The temperature dropped fast, and by the time we ate, I could see my breath inside the cabin. Eric turned in early, and I stayed up for a while, sitting by the fire and listening. The woods were still. No wind, no insects, no movement. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving slowly through the undergrowth. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or a coyote, but the sound didn't wander or pause like an animal would. It was steady, deliberate, getting closer. I held my breath. The sound stopped just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. I waited, listening. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was my imagination, stirred the fire, and finally lay down on the mattress. Took a long time to fall asleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, barely lighting the room. The air was freezing. For a second, I didn't know what had woken me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, not distant this time, not at the tree line. They were right outside the cabin. Slow, shuffling steps circling the walls. My body locked up. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The sound moved around the cabin, passing the front door, then the side wall, then stopping near the back. I strained my ears. Silence. Then, a light scraping sound just beneath the window. A slow, dragging movement against the wood, like something feeling along the outside of the cabin. I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, heart hammering. Then it stopped. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't dare move, waiting, listening. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, Eric acted normal. He hadn't heard anything. I went outside and checked around the cabin, but there were no footprints, no marks, nothing to prove what I had heard. We spent the day hiking. I tried to shake the feeling, but the further we got from the cabin, the more I felt like something was watching us. Every time we stopped, every time we rested, the feeling was there. By the time we got back, the sun was starting to set. That's when I saw it. The front door. It was open. I knew we had locked it before leaving. Eric swore he had the only key. He tried to brush it off, saying maybe the wind pushed it open, but the lock was unlatched. I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing, but something felt wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound set me on edge. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I forced myself to stay still, listening. The sound circled the cabin, slower this time, deliberate. Then, asterisk, a soft thud against the wall. Asterisk. My breath caught. It wasn't at the window this time. It was at the door. Another thud. Then the sound of something dragging across the wood. I clenched my teeth, gripping the blankets tight, every nerve in my body screaming. The doorknob rattled, slow at first, then harder. Then it stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. An hour. Maybe more. I didn't sleep. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. Eric still didn't believe me. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. We packed up fast, loading our gear, dousing the fire. I didn't even eat breakfast. Then I saw them. Footprints. Just beyond the tree line. Not boots. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. Leading from the woods. Circling the cabin. And disappearing back into the trees. We left. I didn't say a word the whole hike back to the truck. Eric never invited me back. I never asked to go. And I never... never Want to know what would have happened if I had opened that door? I don't know what made me say yes to the trip in the first place. Maybe it was the need to get away, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle being out there, alone in the woods, without cell service, without the hum of traffic in the distance. The thought of isolation had been appealing at first, almost comforting. But that was before I knew what it really felt like to be cut off from everything. I'd rented the cabin for 3 nights. It was a small place, tucked deep into the mountains, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. The online listing had described it as a cozy off-grid retreat, with breathtaking views and complete solitude. It had running water, a wood stove, and a generator for electricity, but no internet, no phone signal. A landline for emergencies, but that was it. The pictures made it look perfect, dark wood siding, a front porch with a pair of rocking chairs, a dense forest stretching out in every direction. It felt like the kind of place where no one would bother me. The road leading up to it was just a narrow dirt path, winding through the trees, barely wide enough for my car. The first thing I noticed when I got there was the silence. Not the peaceful kind either. The kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the way my mind reacted to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I unpacked, bringing my bags inside and checking the place out. It was just one large room with a small kitchen, a bed, and a wood stove in the corner. A bathroom with a composting toilet. Simple but comfortable. The windows were large, letting in the last of the afternoon light, and I could see nothing but trees stretching out in every direction. I locked the door behind me, set my bag down, and lit the wood stove. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't that I felt unsafe exactly, just unsettled. The wind outside was constant, pressing against the cabin in slow, heavy gusts. The trees creaked, branches tapping against the roof, and every now and then, I'd hear something moving out there. A rustling in the leaves, the snap of a twig, probably just deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to ignore it, pulling the thick quilt over me and turning onto my side, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the second day, I had mostly convinced myself I was being paranoid. The morning was cold, the sky overcast, but I felt better once I was up and moving. I spent the day hiking, following an old logging trail that led up the side of the mountain. The higher I climbed, the more I could see. The forest stretching out in waves of dark green, the distant peaks capped with snow. It was beautiful, but something felt off. I kept catching glimpses of movement between the trees. Too far to see clearly, just a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing. No sound, no footprints. Just the trees swaying in the wind. By late afternoon, I'd had enough. I hiked back to the cabin, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I had been alone too long, and my brain was making things up to fill the silence. But that night, I woke up to something much worse. It was the sound that did it. A slow, deliberate scraping against the outside of the cabin. I froze. The wood stove had burned down to just embers, leaving the room in near darkness. The only light came from the moon through the window, casting long, pale streaks across the floor. My breath felt too loud in my own ears, my heart slamming against my ribs. There it was again, a long, dragging sound, moving along the wall just outside, like something rough being scraped against the wood. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then a thud. Something knocked against the door. Not the wind, not an animal. A knock. I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The cabin was miles from anyone. No one should be here. No one would be here. Another knock. Harder this time. I reached for my flashlight with a shaking hand and flicked it on, sweeping it toward the door. Nothing. I waited. Minutes passed, the silence stretching unbearably long. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin toward the window. I turned off the flashlight, sinking lower into the bed. My breathing was too loud, but I couldn't seem to control it. I felt it before I saw it. An overwhelming certainty that something was standing just outside the window, watching me. I didn't dare move. Seconds crawled by. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving away. I lay there for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. Finally, just as dawn started to creep through the trees, exhaustion took over. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I barely hesitated. I threw my things into my bag, making sure I left nothing behind. I stepped outside, heart hammering as I scanned the ground around the cabin. Footprints, deep, clear boot prints in the dirt, circling the cabin. Not mine. I ran to my car, yanking the door open and throwing my bag inside. That's when I noticed something else. The lock on the front door. It was scratched, the metal gouged, like someone had been trying to force it open. I didn't stop to think. I got in the car, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road faster than I ever should have, the tires skidding in the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this. If I had unlocked that door, if I had let my curiosity get the better of me, I might not be here to tell this story. And that cabin? I never looked back. I don't know why I thought renting a remote cabin in the middle of the woods was a good idea. Maybe I wanted some peace, maybe I wanted to get away from everything, or maybe I just didn't think things through. It wasn't supposed to be some horror movie scenario. Just a weekend alone, no distractions, no work, no people. Just me, some books, and the quiet. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was small, maybe 20 by 25 feet, just a single-room structure with a kitchen corner, a small fireplace, a bed pushed up against one wall, and a single bathroom. It was old but solid. Wooden walls, heavy door, thick glass windows, nothing modern but sturdy. I drove up late Friday afternoon, following a dirt road that wound through dense trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just isolation. That was the point. I parked my car beside the cabin, unloaded my bag, locked the car, and stepped inside. The place smelled like aged wood and dust, but it was clean enough. The silence was almost overwhelming at first, the kind of quiet you don't really notice until you're deep in it. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity, just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood settling. I spent the evening the way I planned, reading, eating, enjoying the solitude. The sun set behind the trees, and the cabin grew dark except for the soft glow of my lantern. I built a small fire in the fireplace, more for comfort than warmth, and eventually went to bed. It was sometime past midnight when I woke up. Not fully, not at first. Just enough to realize something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down, and the cabin was almost pitch black except for a faint sliver of moonlight through the window. Then I heard it. Something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. The wind had a rhythm, a steady rustling through the trees. This was different. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Footsteps. At first, I tried to tell myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became. This wasn't the sound of hooves or paws. This was the weight of a person, boots pressing into the dirt, moving carefully around the cabin. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, heart pounding so hard I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I wanted to look, but I didn't want to move. If there was someone outside, they'd see any movement through the windows. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the door. Silence. Long, stretching silence. I waited, counting the seconds. Nothing. Then, the doorknob rattled. A slow, deliberate test, like someone checking if it was locked. I froze. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were trying to get in. The door was locked. I made sure of that when I came in. But suddenly, it didn't feel strong enough. It wasn't a deadbolt, just an old-fashioned latch lock. If they really wanted to get in, they could. The rattling stopped. More silence. Then the footsteps moved again, this time toward the window. I held my breath, eyes locked on the faint outline of the glass. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel them standing there, watching. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, maybe longer. But eventually, the footsteps moved away. Slowly, carefully, back toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the first light of morning crept through the trees, I was exhausted, but still alert. I stayed inside for another hour, waiting, listening. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, there were footprints in the dirt. Large, booted prints, circling the cabin, stopping at the door and window. Whoever it was, they hadn't run. They had walked, slow, patient. I wanted to leave, but I had no real reason. Nothing had actually happened. No one had broken in, no one had hurt me. Could have been a lost hiker. Could have been nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Still, I forced myself to stay. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I was alone in the woods, my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I locked up early, made sure the fire was going, and tried to sleep. I didn't. Around midnight, it happened again. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Moving around the cabin. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. I had an old hunting knife in my bag, but what was I going to do with it? If someone really wanted to get in, a knife wasn't going to stop them. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then, a sound near the back wall. A soft scrape, like metal against wood. I gripped the knife, body tense. The sound stopped. More silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I didn't move until morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the back wall, I saw it. A small mark just below the window. A thin, deliberate scratch in the wood, like someone had tested it. That was enough for me. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and left. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, didn't check my phone until I had service again. When I finally did, I pulled up the listing for the cabin. No reviews, no history, just an address and a contact email. I never went back, and I never found out who was out there. I was looking forward to a weekend alone in the mountains. Work had been wearing me down, and the thought of spending 3 days in a rented cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air, sounded perfect. I found the place online, a small old log cabin deep in the woods, a good 10 miles from the nearest town. The listing mentioned that it had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to unplug. The drive up was long, most of it on a winding dirt road. My SUV kicked up dust as I passed miles of dense forest, the trees growing thicker the higher I climbed. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour when I finally spotted the cabin up ahead, tucked between tall pines. It was just like the pictures. Small, rustic, with a stone chimney and a wide porch overlooking a valley below. I parked next to the cabin and got out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, colder than I expected for late summer. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up to the door. The key was under a loose rock, just as the owner had said. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a stack of firewood beside it. The furniture was simple, just a couch, a wooden table, and a single rocking chair by the window. A small kitchenette was tucked in the corner, and a narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. I set my bag down and walked over to the window. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. From here, I could see the trail leading down the hill, disappearing into the woods. There wasn't a single sound outside. No cars, no voices, not even birds. Just complete, heavy silence. That first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, then went to bed early. The bed was old, the mattress thin, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented. The room was pitch dark, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Then I heard it again, a crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. I sat up, my mind still foggy. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal, too steady, too heavy. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I clicked the screen, there was no service. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe it was just the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing outside, just listening. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. But the night was silent again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the sunlight. Everything looked normal. The forest stretched out in every direction, undisturbed. But when I glanced down, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. The prints were large, deep enough to suggest weight, and they led from the tree line right up to the porch. Whoever had been out here last night had stood just a few feet from my door before turning back into the woods. A chill ran through me. I wasn't the only person out here. I tried to push the thought away as I went about my day. I hiked a few trails, took some photos, tried to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I locked the door and shut the curtains before climbing into bed. I didn't expect to sleep much, and I was right. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind rustling through the trees, the creak of the porch settling. I lay there, gripping the blanket, staring into the darkness. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slower this time, more cautious, moving along the porch. I held my breath, barely daring to move. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid whoever was outside would hear it. Then, a soft tap against the window. I nearly stopped breathing. Another tap, fingertips testing the glass. I stayed completely still. My mind was racing. What do I do? If I turned on a light, would it scare them off? Or would it let them know I was awake? Should I grab something for protection? My phone still had no service. Calling for help wasn't an option. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to go outside. The footprints were there again, clear in the dirt. This time, they circled the cabin. Whoever it was had been walking around my home all night, watching. I didn't stay for the third night. I packed up and got in my car, heart racing the whole time. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror. And then I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, his skin pale, his hair wild and unkempt. He was barefoot, and he was watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove straight back to town, only relaxing once I saw other cars on the road. When I returned the key, I told the cabin owner about the footprints. He frowned, scratching his head. "You sure? That place is pretty isolated. Nobody ever goes up there." I didn't argue. I just nodded, got in my car, and left. I never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about that area, and I found something. 15 years ago, a man had been living in those woods. A recluse, people said. He never spoke to anyone, just wandered through the forest. One day, a hiker went missing near the cabin. They searched for weeks but never found him. The old man was questioned but never arrested. Eventually, he disappeared, vanishing into the wilderness. No one had seen him since, until now. Here's a first-person, highly detailed, realistic scary cabin story. I've made it long and immersive, focusing on real-world fear and danger, with no supernatural elements. #### deep in the woods. I never liked the idea of staying in an isolated cabin, but I let my friend convince me. He owned a small place deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was old but sturdy, built by his grandfather decades ago. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, an outhouse, and an old gas-powered generator that barely worked. It sat at the edge of a lake, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. He swore it was peaceful. Good for the soul, he told me. I wasn't so sure. He had work and couldn't come with me, but he insisted I go alone. "Just relax for a few days," he said. "Clear your head." He gave me a map and the key, told me where to find the firewood, the water pump, and the shotgun his grandfather kept under the bed. "You probably won't need it," he said with a grin, "but it's there." The drive was long, the roads turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The place looked exactly like I expected. Dark wood, a small front porch, a sagging roof. The lake behind it was still, black water reflecting the trees like a mirror. I stepped inside, and dust floated in the air. The place smelled like old wood and something damp. The generator coughed when I started it, but the lights flickered on. I checked the corners, opened the cabinets, tested the locks on the door and windows. Everything seemed fine. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the wood stove, heated up some canned soup, and read by flashlight. The silence was thick. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every rustling leaf outside. Around midnight, I stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the stars sharp and bright. The lake was perfectly still. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just me, the trees, and the water. I slept lightly, waking up at every little noise. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the trees settling. #### day 2. The morning was cold. I brewed coffee on the propane stove and stepped outside. The forest smelled fresh, damp with dew. I decided to hike a bit, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps crunching on dead leaves. I found an old hunting stand about a mile in. It was falling apart, wooden slats covered in moss. Nearby, I spotted something strange. A pile of bones. Not fresh, but not fully bleached either. Probably a deer, though I didn't see a skull. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned back. That afternoon, I went down to the lake. The water was ice cold. I walked along the shore, kicking rocks, watching the ripples spread. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were old, edges softened by the wind, but they led from the trees down to the water and back again. Barefoot, the size of an adult's. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Maybe someone had gone for a swim, but it felt wrong. That night, I locked the door and kept the shotgun next to my bed. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, something heavier. I stayed still, listening. Leaves crunching. A slow, deliberate sound. Close to the cabin. Then a thud, wood against wood. The porch. I grabbed the shotgun and slid out of bed. My heart was pounding. I moved quietly to the window and peered out. Nothing. The trees stood dark and motionless. The lake was black glass. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe the wind knocking something loose. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep. I found the footprints in the morning. Fresh. They started at the edge of the trees, leading right up to the cabin. And then they stopped. No return tracks. Just gone. I felt something cold creep up my spine. Someone had been here, watching. I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night, but as I loaded my bag into the truck, I heard it again. Movement in the trees. I turned fast, shotgun raised. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. I climbed into the truck and locked the doors. The engine roared to life and I threw it into gear. Gravel kicked up as I sped down the dirt road. I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting to see something. Nothing. The cabin disappeared behind the trees. But a mile down the road, something caught my eye. A figure standing just off the path. Too far to see clearly, but close enough. Watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove straight through the night all the way home. I never went back. (2010) British Columbia. A group of us, packed into an old bus, rolling through the mountains. The plan was simple. Travel, explore, sleep where we could, and move on. But plans don't always go the way you expect. The bus broke down in a small town. One of those places you only stop in if you have to. A few buildings, a gas station, a general store, and a mechanic's shop. That was it. Mountains and thick forest pressed in from all sides. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the town itself felt half forgotten. We pulled up to the mechanic, hoping it was just a small fix, but after a quick look under the hood, the guy told us it would take at least a night to get it running again. Maybe longer. We had no choice but to wait. No extra money for a motel, and even if we did, there wasn't one here. So we asked the mechanic if there was somewhere we could camp for free. He pointed behind his shop to the tree line where a river ran down from the mountains. Said it should be fine for the night, but we should watch out for bears. That was the first red flag. Bears weren't unusual out here, but something about the way he said it stuck with me. He didn't seem overly concerned. No warnings about food storage, no talk about bear spray, just a short watch out for bears, like he was saying something else without saying it. But at the time, I brushed it off. We grabbed our bags and headed into the woods. The trees were dense, towering pines with thick undergrowth, the ground covered in a soft layer of fallen needles and leaves. The river wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk in. It was fast-moving and cold, cutting a jagged path through the landscape, its banks covered in smooth, wet stones. We spread out looking for a good camping spot. That's when we saw the first destroyed campsite. At first, it looked like just another clearing, but as we got closer, we saw the remnants of a tent, ripped open down the middle. The fabric hung in shreds, poles snapped, belongings scattered. A sleeping bag, still zipped, half buried in the dirt. A backpack torn open, clothes spilling out. It had been there for a while, long enough for the weather to start reclaiming it. No footprints, no tracks, just an empty, abandoned mess. A bear attack. Maybe, but something felt off. There were no claw marks, no bite marks, no sign of food being dragged away. Just destruction. We kept going. Then we found the second one. Same story. A wrecked tent, a campsite frozen in time. Clothes, gear, and personal belongings left behind. No blood.
No bodies,
just emptiness, like whoever had been there had left in a hurry and never came back. At that point, unease settled in. Two abandoned campsites, side by side, both wrecked but with no sign of a struggle beyond the torn fabric. No footprints leading away, no signs of a scuffle, just gone. I walked through the second site, kicking through the debris. That's when I saw it. A small ceramic wind-up clown doll. It sat half buried in the dirt, its white face smeared with mud, red lips frozen in a wide, painted grin. The little metal key stuck out from its back. Without thinking, I picked it up and turned the key. The lullaby started playing. A slow, tinny, off-key melody. I shut it off immediately and put it back down. Something about it made my skin crawl. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong in the middle of the woods, surrounded by the ruins of an abandoned campsite. I told myself it was nothing, just some kid's toy. We moved on. We found a spot further down, closer to the river. It was clear, flat, with enough space to set up without being too deep in the woods. We pitched our tents, built a small fire, and tried to shake the feeling from earlier. The night settled in quickly. The fire crackled, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cold, damp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The river's rushing water was the only constant sound, covering the small noises of the forest. I kept thinking about those campsites, the way they'd been left behind, the feeling they gave me. My mind kept circling back to that doll, that awful song. But I didn't say anything. No one did. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Then I heard something, a branch snapping. Not close, but not far either. I sat up, listening. The sound of the river made it hard to tell where it came from, but it was out there. Something moving through the trees. Another snap. Closer. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond it, the woods were pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That thick, pressing weight of something unseen watching from the dark. Then silence. Nothing moved. No wind. No animals. Just the river and the faint crackling of dying embers. I stayed awake for a long time, staring into the blackness, waiting for something else. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion won and I slept. Morning came with heavy mist rolling in from the river. Everything was damp, the air thick and cold. That's when we noticed it. Not footprints, not tracks, just absence. The clown doll was gone. I walked back to the second abandoned campsite, retracing my steps. It should have been there right where I left it. But the ground was empty, no sign of it. The only thing left was the wind stirring through the trees and the feeling that we had never been alone out there. We packed up quickly, not saying much. The bus was fixed by the time we got back to town, and we left without looking back. I still don't know what happened at those campsites. I don't know who or what left them behind, and I don't know where that clown doll went. Camping deep in the woods always seemed like a good idea. Quiet, secluded, far from the noise of other people. That's exactly what my friends and I wanted when we set out for our trip a few years ago. We had planned for days, packed everything we needed, and drove hours to reach a campground we had heard good things about. But when we got there, it was completely full. Every designated site had a tent, a camper, or a group already settled in, and we weren't interested in squeezing ourselves into some cramped space right next to strangers. One of my friends, James, suggested we drive further into the forest to find our own spot. It was national forest land, so camping was allowed anywhere as long as we were careful with fires and followed the rules. It sounded like the perfect solution. We took an old logging road that wound deep into the trees, bouncing over potholes and rocks as we went. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. No other people, no signs of anyone camping, just endless trees stretching in every direction. Eventually, after about half an hour of slow, careful driving, we found a small clearing. It was flat, surrounded by tall trees, and far enough from the road that we wouldn't be disturbed. It was perfect. We set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. Tents went up, firewood was gathered, and soon we had a small fire crackling in the center of our site. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, like we had the entire forest to ourselves. We sat around the fire, ate, and talked late into the night. When we finally crawled into our tents, the woods were completely still. That stillness didn't last. I woke up suddenly. For a moment, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint orange glow. The air was cold, and my breath felt sharp in my lungs. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it, a low, steady drumming. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. Then, underneath the drumming, I heard voices. They weren't talking, they were singing. The sound rose and fell in a way that felt ancient, something deep and full of meaning, though I couldn't understand a word of it. It wasn't like a normal song you'd hear on the radio. It was something else, something older. My skin prickled. I waited, hoping to hear some sign that it was just another group of campers. Maybe someone playing music on a speaker, maybe a drum circle, but something felt off. The sound didn't seem to come from one direction. It was like it was all around us, woven into the trees. I sat there, frozen, my ears straining. The others in my tent were awake too. I could hear them shifting, breathing a little too fast. I wasn't the only one who felt it. This deep, stomach-churning sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just the drumming or the singing. It was the way it made the night feel different, like the air itself was heavier. Minutes passed, then an hour. The drumming never changed. It didn't move closer, didn't fade away. It just kept going, steady, constant, as if it had been there long before we arrived and would continue long after we were gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I crawled out of the tent as quietly as I could, my breath fogging in the cold air. The fire had burned down to little more than glowing coals, barely lighting the clearing. The trees loomed dark and silent beyond its glow. There was no one there. I turned in slow circles, trying to pinpoint the sound, but it was useless. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. My stomach twisted. I backed toward the car, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the firelight, watching. Nothing. I wasn't the only one freaked out. The others climbed out of their tents, their faces pale in the dim light. No one spoke, but we didn't need to. We grabbed our sleeping bags and moved to the car. Crammed together, uncomfortable, unable to sleep, we sat in silence and listened to the drums. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windshield. The drumming was gone. None of us talked about it at first. It was like we all wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. But as we ate breakfast in the cold morning air, the tension hung over us. Finally, James broke the silence. "There's gotta be someone else out here." We all knew what he meant. The sound we heard hadn't been natural. Someone had to have made it. We decided to look. We spent hours hiking in wide circles around our campsite, searching for any sign of another group. Footprints, a fire pit, tire tracks, anything. There was nothing. The ground was covered in old pine needles and fallen leaves, undisturbed except for our own tracks. We hiked up to a small ridge to get a better view of the area. The forest stretched out in every direction, unbroken. If anyone had been nearby, we would have seen them. I didn't like that. We tried to reason it away. Maybe it had come from farther away than we thought. Maybe sound carried strangely in the forest. Maybe it was a trick of the wind. None of those explanations felt right. But we didn't leave. We should have, but we didn't. That night, we stayed up late around the fire, trying to shake the unease that clung to us. We laughed a little too loud, told stories, acted like everything was fine. Eventually, we crawled into our tents. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, waiting. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I know exactly when I woke up. 2 a.m. The drumming was back. Only this time it was louder. The singing was louder too. More voices. Closer. Couldn't breathe. Felt like the entire forest was watching. The air inside the tent was stifling. I could hear the others moving, awake, silent. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to acknowledge what was happening. The drumming grew louder. I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. The urge to run, to hide, to do something was overwhelming. But where would we go? We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. So we stayed. Hours passed. The sound never faded, never changed. It just stayed, pressing in around us, filling every empty space. I don't think I slept at all. When dawn finally came, the sound was gone. We packed up. We didn't talk. We just moved, shoving gear into bags, rolling up tents, stuffing everything into the car as fast as we could. We drove straight to the original campground. It had an open spot. We took it. That night, there was no drumming, no singing, just the quiet hum of other campers, the occasional crackle of distant fires, the normal sounds of a normal night. I don't know what we heard out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Something was out there. I don't know why I thought camping alone in the national forest was a good idea. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted a break from everything. Work, the noise of the city, the feeling of being stuck. I've been camping before, plenty of times, but always with friends. This time, I wanted to do it alone. I wanted to see if I could handle it. I picked a spot deep in the woods, well away from the usual campsites, about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road. I parked my truck where the trailhead started, slung my heavy pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The further I went, the quieter it got. No more distant hum of cars, no voices, no civilization. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the trail, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. I walked for hours, following a narrow game trail that weaved through thick forest and up rocky hills. The sun had started to dip low when I finally found a spot that felt right. Flat ground, a clearing just big enough for my tent, with a steep ridge behind me and a thick wall of pines all around. It felt protected, safe. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and set up camp. By the time my tent was up and my small fire was going, the sky was dark. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like salt on black fabric. I ate a simple meal, jerky, some nuts, a granola bar, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, for a while. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, just past the firelight, somewhere beyond the trees. A soft, slow movement, not the quick darting of a small animal. Something bigger, something careful. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me. The wind sighed through the pines. I told myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. Nothing to be worried about. But then I heard it again. Closer. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. Then silence. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. Nothing. Just darkness between the trunks. My gut told me to listen, to stay still. But I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, so I called it out in my head as paranoia. Still, I banked the fire low before climbing into my tent. If something was out there, I didn't want to advertise my presence any more than I already had. Lying there in my sleeping bag, I listened for a long time. Nothing, just the wind. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to embers. The air inside the tent was cold. I stayed still, listening, and then I heard it, breathing, not mine, outside the tent. Close, slow, heavy breaths. My mind went blank with fear. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound shifted. A soft crunch of pine needles. A step, then another. Whoever or whatever it was right outside the tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my fingers ached. My brain raced through possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? Person? None of them were good options. I wanted to look, but I didn't want to move. I strained my ears. The breathing was low, controlled. Not the snorting huff of a bear. Not the quick, light panting of a cat. It was slow, steady, human. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I knew one thing. Whoever was out there, they were trying not to be heard. They were waiting, watching. I stayed still for what felt like hours. My muscles ached from holding position. I listened, barely breathing, waiting for some sign of movement. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it. A slow, careful step, then another, moving away. I stayed frozen. 5 minutes, 10. I forced myself to count. When I finally worked up the courage, I reached for my flashlight, turning it on as quietly as I could. I unzipped the tent an inch, then another, then enough to peek out. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent. No sign of anyone, but I knew what I'd heard. I waited until dawn before stepping out. My fire was just cold ash now. My breath puffed in the chilly morning air. I walked the edge of my camp, looking for tracks. I found them. Bootprints. Large, deep, a man's judging by the size. And they hadn't come from the trail. They had come from the forest. There were no prints leading up to my camp. Only prints leading away, like they had been standing there, waiting, watching for a long time before finally leaving. I packed up my gear in record time. My hands were shaking as I worked. The whole hike back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart pound. I didn't relax until I was in my truck, doors locked, engine running. I never saw anyone, never heard anything else. But I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere out there in those woods, someone had been watching me, waiting, and if I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know when the fear truly set in. Maybe it was the moment I realized the trail markers had stopped appearing, or maybe it was when I checked my phone for the 10th time and saw there was still no signal. Either way, I was lost, deep in the woods, alone, with no clear way back. It had started as a simple day hike, something I had done plenty of times before. The plan was to follow a marked trail up into the hills, get a good view of the valley, and then loop back before sunset. I had packed light, just a day pack with a water bottle, a granola bar, and a cheap folding knife I never expected to use. My boots were broken in, my jacket was warm enough, and the sky had been clear when I set out. I'd followed the main path for about an hour before I spotted a smaller, narrower trail veering off to the side. It looked well worn, and I figured it was a shortcut or an alternate route. Without giving it much thought, I stepped off the main trail and followed it into the trees. First, everything seemed fine. The path was tight but easy enough to walk, winding gently uphill. The woods here were thick, dense pines mixed with broadleaf trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through in broken patches, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. birds chirped somewhere above, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth signaling a squirrel or something small moving nearby. Felt peaceful. That peace didn't last. I should have noticed when the trail narrowed even more, when the packed dirt gave way to loose leaves and tangled roots. I should have turned back when I had the chance. But I didn't. I kept going, assuming the path would loop back onto the main trail eventually. That assumption was my first mistake. After another 20 minutes of walking, the path faded into nothing. No more packed dirt, no more footprints, just forest. I stopped, looked around. No sign of the main trail. I turned in a slow circle, scanning for anything familiar, anything that might tell me where I had gone wrong. But every direction looked the same. Trees, underbrush, scattered rocks, the occasional fallen log. The forest wasn't just thick here, it felt untouched. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't that far off trail. I could just backtrack, follow my own footprints if they were still visible. Except they weren't. The ground here was covered in layers of fallen leaves, twigs, and pine needles. Whatever faint path I had followed had completely disappeared behind me. The realization hit hard. I had no idea where I was. I pulled out my phone. No service. That was expected, but it still sent a cold knot of unease through my stomach. I had hiked in remote areas before, so I knew cell towers didn't always reach these places. But still, seeing that little no signal at the top of my screen made my situation feel a lot more real. I swallowed and turned in what I thought was the right direction. Walking slowly, I tried to retrace my steps. The forest was quiet now. The birds had stopped chirping. It should have been a short walk back to where the trail had been. But after 20 minutes, nothing looked familiar. I kept walking. 30 minutes. Nothing. The sun was lower in the sky now. Not quite setting, but I could see the change in the light. Longer shadows, the air growing cooler. I stopped again, this time really listening. The wind shifted through the trees, rustling the leaves above. But something else felt off. The woods felt different. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the weight of the silence. The feeling that something was watching. I shook the thought away. I was letting my nerves get to me. I needed to focus, keep moving. I turned and picked up my pace, forcing myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. Then I saw it. A shape, not a person. An object, a structure, partially hidden in the trees ahead. There was something. An old wooden frame, barely standing, weathered and gray. A hunting blind, maybe, or what was left of one. It was tilted, half collapsed, the wood rotting away. It meant people had been here before. I stepped closer, hoping to find some clue. An old trail marker, a sign, anything. But as I approached, the feeling of unease deepened. The structure wasn't empty. There was something inside. At first, I thought it was an animal carcass. A deer, maybe, dragged inside by a predator. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a carcass. It was bones, scattered on the wooden floor. Small ones, clean, white, picked dry. Something had been here recently. I turned sharply, heart pounding. I needed to leave. Now, I walked faster, keeping my breathing steady. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, but I forced myself not to look back. The light was fading fast. Then I heard it. A sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something moving behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I picked up my pace, pushing through the undergrowth, snapping branches underfoot. I wasn't walking anymore, I was running. The sound behind me got louder. Footsteps. Heavy. Not human. I ran harder, lungs burning, branches clawing at my arms. Then the ground disappeared. I fell, tumbling, rolling, dirt and leaves in my mouth, my arms flailing for something, anything, to stop me. I hit the bottom hard, landing on my side. Pain exploded through my shoulder, but I barely had time to process it. I scrambled up, gasping, looking around. I was in a ravine, and I wasn't alone. Across from me, just at the tree line, something stood. It was large, too large. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, just the shape. A hunched, broad-shouldered form standing still, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then slowly it stepped back, disappearing into the trees. Silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. When I finally moved, my entire body was shaking. I had to get out. Ignoring the pain, I climbed, scrambling up the ravine. Took everything I had, but I made it. Then I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw something through the trees. An old dirt road. Relief flooded through me. I stumbled onto it, following it blindly. After what felt like an eternity, I saw lights, parked truck, a man standing by it, a hunter. He saw me and waved. I ran toward him, barely able to speak, gasping for breath. He looked at me like he already knew. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't have to. I just asked for a ride back. And I never went back to those woods again. I've worked in Yellowstone for a long time, spent years hiking its backcountry, learning its rhythms, seeing how nature moves and breathes when no one's around to watch. I've seen wolf kills, bear kills, cougars stashing their prey. I know what a fresh carcass looks like, what scavenged remains tell you, how a predator's habits leave their own kind of story in the dirt. That's why what I found in Lamar Valley a couple weeks ago stuck with me. It didn't fit. Lamar Valley is one of the wildest parts of the park. A stretch of open land, rolling grass and sagebrush, cut through with creeks and scattered with bison. Tourists drive through on the main road, maybe pull over to snap a picture of a wolf pack in the distance, but few venture far from their cars. Even fewer hike deep into it. That day, I was about 11 miles from the nearest road, far beyond where most people ever set foot. The sun was high, late morning, maybe close to noon. The air had that crisp, dry smell of late summer, when the grass has baked under months of sun and the streams run low. I had been hiking for a few hours, following a faint game trail that cut through the valley, not expecting to find much more than tracks and maybe an old shed antler if I was lucky. Then I saw it, right in the middle of the trail. A deer head, just sitting there. Not a carcass, not the aftermath of a kill, just a head. I stopped dead, staring at it. Something was immediately wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My first thought was a wolf kill, but there was no sign of a struggle. No tufts of fur, no bloodstains in the dirt. And the head itself, it was too clean, too perfect. The cut wasn't ragged, like you'd expect from a predator tearing a carcass apart. It was smooth, precise. I crouched down, taking a closer look. It was a doe, no antlers, no reason for a poacher to take just the head. The eyes were still there, glossy and vacant. The tongue was intact, lolling slightly between its teeth. The skin around the severance was eerily smooth, with no jagged edges, no signs of tearing or chewing. It wasn't just that the head was severed, it was the way it was severed. Almost like it had been cut with a blade. I looked around. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the grass, the distant shapes of bison grazing, the low hum of insects. No blood. That part stuck with me. Even if someone had done this with a knife, there should have been blood. A severed head doesn't just appear without a mess. But the dirt beneath it was dry, undisturbed, as if someone had just placed it there. I stood up and did a slow circle, scanning the land around me. The openness of Lamar Valley can be deceiving. It looks empty at a glance, but there are dips and rises, shallow ravines that hide movement until something is right on top of you. I listened. Nothing but the wind.
no birds.
That was the second thing that got under my skin. A fresh kill, even one this strange, should have drawn ravens. Magpies, something. Scavengers pick up on death fast out here. But the head was untouched.
No pick marks.
No missing eyes. It was like nothing wanted to get near it. I've seen plenty of weird things in the wild. I've come across bear dens filled with half-eaten elk bones. Found cougar kills stashed so high in the trees you'd think they had opposable thumbs. I've seen bison carcasses torn apart by wolves, pieces scattered for yards. But this was different. This didn't feel natural. I pulled out my camera and snapped a few photos. Not because I thought anyone would be able to explain it, but because I wanted proof that I hadn't imagined it. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, I kept walking. I didn't touch it, didn't even step too close, just left it there and moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the hike, I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the ridgelines, the folds of land where someone, or something, could be watching. I didn't see anything, but that didn't mean much. In a place like Yellowstone, the land is always watching you, even when you can't see what's doing the watching. I made it back to my truck by late afternoon, locked the doors as soon as I got in. It wasn't like me to be jumpy, but something about that deer head had put me on edge in a way I couldn't explain. I reported it when I got back, sent the photos to a few other rangers, asked if anyone had heard about poachers in the area, maybe some kind of illegal hunting. But no one had any answers. No reports of poaching, no missing research deer, nothing. A week later, I went back. The head was gone.
No bones.
No scraps of fur. No sign it had ever been there. I stood in the exact spot where I had found it, staring at the empty dirt. The grass had grown back over the trail a little, like time had erased the whole thing. I don't have an explanation. I don't know who or what left that head there. I just know that, for the first time in years, I felt like I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. I should have known better than to hike that late in the afternoon. It wasn't my first time out in the woods alone. I'd done plenty of solo camping trips, long day hikes, even some off-trail exploring when I felt confident enough. I had experience, but that didn't matter much once I realized how bad I'd screwed up. I was in the middle of a stretch of national forest, a place so deep that cell service was nothing but a joke. The kind of place where getting lost could mean never being found. I'd come out here for a simple day hike, 6 miles in, 6 miles out, following a lightly marked trail through dense pine forest. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. Everything was fine at first. I kept a good pace, following the markers nailed to the trees. A gusty wind moved through the treetops, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The late afternoon sun was slipping lower, but I wasn't worried yet. I'd brought my headlamp, my map, and an emergency whistle, just in case. But then I made my first mistake. I spotted a side trail cutting off to the left, just a narrow footpath, barely noticeable. Probably an old hunter's route or a game trail, but something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was the itch to explore somewhere new. Whatever it was, I made the decision without thinking too hard about it. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. At first, it was easy to follow. The ground was packed firm, the undergrowth thin. I figured I'd go maybe 10 minutes in, check it out, then turn around and head back. But the deeper I went, the less it felt like a trail. The trees grew closer together. The path under my boots turned soft, spongy with layers of old pine needles. And then, suddenly it was just gone. No trail, no sign of where I'd come from, just endless trees in every direction. I turned, feeling the first sting of panic. The woods looked different now, darker, heavier. The sun had dropped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted across the ground. I looked for any sign of my footprints, any familiar landmarks, but nothing stood out. Everything looked the same. I pulled my phone out just in case. No service. Of course. Taking a slow breath, I tried to stay calm. This wasn't the first time I'd lost a trail. If I kept my head straight, I could backtrack. I turned in what I thought was the right direction and started walking. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The forest only got deeper. The trees pressed in tight, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The wind had died down, and the silence felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. I stopped, trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked the same. That's when I noticed it. Something was moving between the trees. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Just the shifting light, the way the shadows stretched and swayed. But then I saw it again. A shape just barely visible through the trees. Not close, but not far either. I held still, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a black bear, though I hadn't seen any fresh scat or tracks. Still, the thought was enough to get my legs moving again. I picked up my pace. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was useless. The deeper I went, the more turned around I became. The trees all looked the same, the ground covered in thick layers of pine needles. I should have marked my way, snapped some branches, done anything to keep track of where I'd been. I stopped again. The woods had gone completely still. And then, just at the edge of my hearing, a footstep. Not an animal. Not the light, skittering sound of a squirrel or a raccoon. This was heavier, slow, deliberate. I swallowed hard, scanning the trees. Nothing. I forced myself to keep walking, faster this time. My boots crunched against the forest floor, my breath coming shorter. I told myself I was being paranoid. The woods were playing tricks on me. That's all it was. But then I heard it again. A single step. Closer. I turned too fast, nearly tripping over my own feet. I squinted into the trees, heart hammering in my chest. The light was fading now, the sun slipping below the tree line. Everything was bathed in deep orange, turning to blue. I reached for my headlamp, fingers fumbling with the strap. As I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness and caught something moving. I barely saw it. A shape, a figure just at the edge of the light, standing between the trees, still as a statue. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the light. Someone was out here. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the ground, branches whipping against my arms and face. The forest blurred around me, trees rushing past in a dizzying haze. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to move. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed at me to stop. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree, gasping for breath. My headlamp flickered. The battery was already starting to die. I turned, scanning the woods behind me. Nothing. No movement. No footsteps. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was panicking over nothing. The woods could play tricks on you, especially when the light started to fade. I had to keep moving. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself to think. I needed higher ground. If I could find a ridge, a break in the trees, I might be able to get my bearings. I adjusted my pack and started walking again, every muscle in my body wound tight. Then a sound. Right behind me, a breath. I spun, headlamp swinging wildly. The light caught movement, a flash of something pale, slipping behind a tree. I ran again. I don't know how long I ran. Time blurred. My body moved on instinct, dodging branches, pushing through undergrowth. My breath tore ragged in my chest. I had no idea where I was. No idea if I was even heading in the right direction anymore. Then light. Not my headlamp. not the fading sun, something brighter. I burst through the trees and nearly collapsed. A road, a gravel service road, barely more than a dirt path, but it was something. My knees buckled, and I hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. Behind me, the forest was silent. I sat there for a long time, staring into the trees, watching, waiting, but nothing came out. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I followed the road, legs aching with every step. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance, a ranger's truck. I waved them down. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd gotten lost, that I'd been turned around in the woods for hours. They gave me water, asked if I was okay. I nodded. I didn't tell them about the footsteps, about the breathing, about the thing I saw standing between the trees, because I knew they wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't want to believe it either. I don't know why we decided to go camping that night. It wasn't planned. It wasn't anything we had talked about ahead of time. My brother, his roommate, and I were just sitting around, bored, and someone threw out the idea. Let's go camping. That was it. A couple of hours later, we had our stuff packed and were heading out toward a quiet little spot outside of town. It wasn't a big campsite or anything official. Just a patch of woods near a creek where people sometimes camped. There weren't any real trails or designated spots. Just a few clearings where past campers had set up before, the remains of old fire pits filled with crumbling, blackened wood. It was quiet too. No one else around. That's what we wanted. We got there late in the afternoon, set up our tent, and got a small fire going before it got dark. We had a cooler with some drinks and snacks, nothing too fancy. Mostly, we just sat around, shooting the shit and enjoying being out in the woods. The air was cool but not too cold, the sky clear. Perfect camping weather. We didn't stay up too late. After a few hours, the fire burned down to glowing embers and we were all feeling tired. We killed what was left of the flames, made sure everything was cleaned up, and climbed into the tent. It wasn't a big one, just enough room for the three of us if we didn't mind being a little cramped. I don't know how long I had been asleep when my brother shook me awake. My brain was foggy, still halfway in a dream, and I almost asked him what the hell he wanted. But before I could say anything, I heard it. A voice. Loud, slurred, screaming. At first, I couldn't tell what the guy was yelling. It was just noise coming from somewhere in the woods, bouncing off the trees. My brother and his roommate were both awake, sitting up, listening. For a second, I thought maybe it was someone messing around, a group of drunk campers having fun somewhere nearby. But there weren't any other campers. We would have seen them when we got here. The yelling got closer. It wasn't a group. It was one guy. I still couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone was all over the place. One second he was shouting something like a war cry, the next it sounded like he was arguing with himself. His words slurred together like he was wasted or high on something strong. Then came the crashing. Branches snapping, footsteps stomping, the sound of someone moving fast through the brush without any care for what was in the way. He was coming right toward us. I felt my stomach tighten. We were in the middle of nowhere. No one was around. No one was supposed to be around. It was almost 3 a.m, and this guy was running through the woods screaming like a maniac. I heard my brother move next to me. A slow, deliberate sound of metal sliding. His pistol. None of us said anything. We just sat there, listening as the guy got closer and closer. My brother's roommate had his phone in his hand, but there was no service out here. Then he was outside our tent. I could hear him breathing. Deep, labored, almost like he was growling under his breath. He was pacing, back and forth, right outside the thin nylon fabric separating us. We waited. My brother shifted just enough for the click of his gun to be unmistakable. And then silence. A long pause, just heavy breathing on the other side of the tent. Then, just as fast as he had come crashing in, he was gone. We stayed awake for a long time after that, listening, waiting to see if he'd come back. But the woods were quiet again. The air was still. The fire was long dead, leaving only darkness. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was the sound of sirens. Distant at first, growing louder. Then red and blue lights flashing through the trees. Voices. Drop it. Drop it now. And then tasers. The sharp, crackling snap of electricity. A loud, involuntary groan. The thud of a body hitting the dirt. More yelling. More movement. But then it was over. We didn't get out of the tent. Just lay there, listening, wide awake now. After a while, the voices faded. The lights disappeared. The sirens started up again, moving away this time. Then the woods were quiet. None of us said a word. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. When I woke up, the sun was already up. We crawled out of the tent and looked around. No sign of anything unusual except for a few broken branches where the guy must have come through. No cops, no caution tape. Just the same woods, the same clearing, the same dying fire pit. My brother stretched, groaned, and looked at me. Well, he said, that was weird as hell. His roommate nodded, rubbing his face. We laughed about it. Not because it wasn't serious, but because what else could we do? We packed up our stuff, made sure the fire pit was out, and hiked back to the truck. The drive back to town was quiet. Later that day, we checked the local news. Apparently, some guy had been running around all night, completely out of his mind. No drugs were named in the report, but I'd bet my last dollar it was something strong. He'd been terrorizing campsites, breaking into people's coolers, running through the woods screaming at nothing. The cops caught up to him near where we were camping. He had a metal pole in his hands, swinging it at nothing, ranting about something no one could understand. They had to tase him twice before he finally went down. We never went back to that spot after that. Not because we were scared. It just didn't feel the same anymore. I was in the kitchen when my brother came through the door. The way he walked in told me something was wrong before he even said a word. His face was tight, his breath fast like he'd been running, and his hands were shaking just a little. I lost Chester, he said. First, I thought he was messing around. Chester wasn't the type of dog to run off. He knew these woods better than we did. Ever since he was a pup, he'd been darting between trees, chasing rabbits, nosing around the undergrowth like he owned the place. He'd gone out at night on his own plenty of times before and always made his way back. But my brother wasn't joking. He was already explaining. His phone had died, and the dog had been right next to him when something strange happened. A light, he said. Just a beam of light. It had appeared for only a second, a perfect circle right at his feet, before it shot off into the trees. And when he looked down again, Chester was gone. That was all I needed to hear. I grabbed my torch, pulled on my boots, and stepped out into the cold night air. My brother followed, but he hesitated at the edge of the trees. Where exactly were you? I asked. He pointed into the woods. About 5 minutes in, past the clearing. I didn't wait. I walked straight in. The woods weren't dense at first, but the deeper I went, the more the darkness closed around me. My torch cut a narrow path through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I could hear my own footsteps on the damp earth, the snap of twigs beneath my boots, and nothing else. Not a single sound. No wind in the branches. No rustling in the undergrowth. No distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. That wasn't normal. Even at night, there was always some noise. A fox moving through the brush, a hedgehog shuffling in the leaves, a bird stirring in its nest. But tonight, there was nothing. I kept walking. It didn't take long to find Chester. Maybe 20 seconds in, just past a thick oak tree, I saw his shape in the torchlight. He was standing there, still as a statue. His back was turned, his tail tucked between his legs. I called his name, expecting him to turn and bolt toward me, relieved to be found. But he didn't. He just stood there. I stepped closer. Chester. Nothing. I kept my torch trained on him. His body looked tense, his ears pinned back. I could see the slight rise and fall of his chest, the shallow breaths. When I finally reached out and put a hand on his back, I could feel it. His whole body was rigid. That's when he moved. Not a rush toward me, Not the usual tail-wagging excitement. He just walked. Slow, deliberate, like an old dog whose legs didn't work properly anymore. Head low, eyes wide. He didn't even look at me. He walked past me, back toward the house. I followed, keeping my light on him the whole way. The moment we stepped out of the trees, my brother saw us and let out a breath of relief. But something was wrong. Chester didn't run to the door like he always did. He didn't shake himself off like he'd just had a wild adventure. He didn't even acknowledge us. He just walked to his bed, curled up, and stared at the floor. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. I sat down near him, watching his ears twitch every few seconds. He wasn't trembling exactly, but he was close. He wasn't resting either. His eyes stayed open, staring at nothing. Something scared him, my brother muttered. No kidding. But what? I thought about the beam of light he'd described. I asked him about it again, getting every detail. He swore it wasn't a torch. Too bright, too fast, too precise. A perfect circle at his feet before it shot off. A hunter? No, nobody hunted in these woods. Not this close to our house. A drone? Possible. But who would be flying a drone out here at night? And why would it make the dog disappear? I looked back at Chester. He had always been fearless out here. He'd chased badgers twice his size. He'd run off foxes like they were nothing. He never backed down from anything. But now he wouldn't even lift his head. I got up and went back outside. My breath formed little clouds in the cold air. My torchlight swept over the yard, the edge of the trees, the fields beyond. I listened. Nothing. The silence still felt wrong. I took a step toward the trees. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I expected to see something, some hint of what had happened. I stared into the dark for a long moment. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't want to go back in either. Something had happened in there. Something had made Chester afraid to move, afraid to even look at us. I stood there for a long time before turning back to the house. That night, I kept waking up, not because of a noise, but because of the lack of it. Normally, you could hear Chester shifting in his bed, the creak of the floor when he got up for water. But there was nothing, just dead silence. By morning, Chester was moving again, but he wasn't himself. He was slow, hesitant. He stuck close to us, never wandering off like usual. When I took him outside, he wouldn't go near the trees. He'd stop short and just stare. I walked him closer, just to see what he'd do. He whined. I'd never heard him whine like that before. After that night, he never went into the woods again. Even in broad daylight, he'd stop at the edge, ears down, tail tucked. If a rabbit darted into the trees, he wouldn't chase it. If we called him, he'd just sit and wait for us to come back. Something had changed him. My brother and I never figured out what. There were no tracks in the woods. No signs of anything unusual. No one else had been out there. But whatever happened that night, Chester wasn't the same dog after it. And I never walked those woods alone after dark again. I had always thought of myself as a careful hiker. I knew how to read a map, how to keep track of my surroundings, and how to prepare for a trip into the wilderness. But none of that mattered when things went wrong. The plan had been simple: 3 days solo in the backcountry, deep in a national forest where few people went. I had done trips like this before, but this time, I picked a remote section of forest I hadn't explored yet. The trailhead was an hour's drive down a dirt road, and from there, I'd be following a mix of established trails and game trails, eventually looping back to my car. The first day went smoothly. I started early, trekking through a dense pine forest with only the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up better than coffee. My pack was heavy with food and gear, but I didn't mind. I had all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a GPS, a paper map, and a compass as a backup. I made good time and set up camp near a small stream just before sunset. After a quick meal, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade from the sky. There was something calming about being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant rustling of unseen animals. But by the second day, things started to go wrong. I woke up before dawn, packed my gear, and continued along what I thought was the right path. The forest was thicker here, the trees packed closer together, blocking out much of the sunlight. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks, and the trail was narrow, barely visible in some places. After about an hour, I realized something was off. The terrain didn't match my map. I should have been gaining elevation, heading toward a ridgeline, but instead, the ground sloped downward. I stopped and checked my GPS. No signal. That wasn't unusual this deep in the forest, so I pulled out my map and compass. The problem was, I couldn't pinpoint exactly where I was. I decided to backtrack. I turned around and started walking, but after 30 minutes, nothing looked familiar. I hadn't seen my own footprints, which meant I had probably veered off without realizing it. That's when the first wave of unease hit me. I was lost. I tried to stay calm. The worst thing you can do in a situation like this is panic. I knew that. People who panic make stupid decisions. They wander in circles, they waste energy, they exhaust themselves. I told myself I just needed to retrace my steps carefully. I picked a direction and walked. The forest felt different now, darker, quieter. There was no wind, no birds, just the sound of my own footsteps. An hour passed, then another. The trees all looked the same. Tall pines, their trunks stretching high into the sky, their branches blocking out most of the light. The underbrush was thick, tangled with brambles and fallen logs. My boots sank into damp earth, and my legs burned from the effort of pushing forward. I stopped to rest, dropping my pack and sitting on a fallen log. My water supply was still good, but I didn't want to waste too much. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. I kept walking. The terrain got steeper, and I realized I was descending into a valley. That wasn't good. If I was lost, heading downward meant I'd have to climb back up later. I considered turning back, but a part of me kept thinking, maybe this leads somewhere. Maybe I'll find a clearing, a landmark, something familiar. But I found nothing, just more trees. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. My legs ached, and my shoulders were sore from my pack. I needed to set up camp before dark. I found a relatively flat area and started unpacking my tent. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping, not just the small sound of a twig breaking underfoot. This was something larger, something moving through the trees. I froze. My first thought was a deer, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps, not the quick, careless movement of an animal. This sounded like something walking. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just dense forest. I waited, heart pounding, ears straining. The sound had stopped. Maybe it had just been my imagination. I shook it off and forced myself to finish setting up camp. I ate a small dinner, climbed into my tent, and tried to sleep. Couldn't. The feeling of being watched never went away. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It was subtle, just the soft rustling of leaves. But it was close, too close. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, heavy, not human. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the tent's mesh window. Nothing, but the breathing had stopped. I waited, gripping my knife, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. Silence. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep again. Morning light woke me. My body was stiff, my mind groggy, but something felt off. I stepped outside and immediately noticed my pack wasn't where I left it. I found it a few feet away, half unzipped. Some of my food was missing. My extra flashlight was gone. Bears. That was my first thought. A bear must have wandered into camp and rummaged through my pack. But there were no claw marks.
No teeth marks.
And the way the pack had been moved, it hadn't been torn open, just carefully unzipped and searched. A bear wouldn't do that. I packed up quickly. I didn't know where I was, but I needed to move.
Ivalkiet fast.
Too fast. I wasn't being careful anymore. I just wanted to get out. The forest was playing tricks on me. Every so often, I swore I heard footsteps behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. At one point, I saw something in the distance. A figure. Not a person, something else. A shape barely visible through the trees. I turned and walked the other way. Hours passed. I was thirsty, tired, and my legs felt like they were on fire. But I couldn't stop. Then I saw it. A boot print. Not mine. Someone else had been here. I didn't wait to find out who. I kept moving, faster, pushing through branches, barely thinking, just moving. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, the trees thinned. Then I saw a dirt road. I practically ran toward it. A few minutes later, I heard an engine. A truck appeared in the distance, kicking up dust. I waved my arms, and it slowed to a stop. The driver was a ranger. I barely managed to explain what had happened. He looked me over, then nodded. "You're lucky," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just climbed into the truck and didn't look back. I still don't know what happened out there. Maybe I was just lost. My mind playing tricks on me. Maybe paranoia made me imagine things. But the missing food, the footprints, the breathing outside my tent. I don't go solo camping anymore,